The main character, David, is not hired for the position due to a lack of the necessary qualifications, but he will definitely be appointed next time. A man passing by tells a colleague that David is unlucky in life. The hero realizes that he has missed his last chance to get this job. The main character reflects on the worthlessness of his life. Out of desperation, he throws himself from the platform under a passing train, wanting to commit suicide. The hero stands in bewilderment because the train did not hit him. Everything around him froze. Next to him, he sees an amazing artifact hanging in the air. The unusual find says that David can fulfill any of his wishes. The hero wishes to return to the past to change his life and become successful. He woke up in a train carriage and, looking at his reflection in the window, discovered that he had become several years younger. Turning his head, he saw a beautiful girl sitting opposite him. It turned out to be the school goddess Judy. David was very surprised because a loser like him could not sit next to such a person. The hero plucked up his courage, started a dialogue with her, and a moment later decided to compliment her, hinting that he loved her. Judy decided that he was harassing her and called her boyfriend John for help. The guy stopped the hero and he felt ashamed of his actions. As David went into another car to make some instant noodles, he saw something like a hologram in front of him, which showed his characteristics, like in a computer game. The hero decided to improve all his stats to level 5 in order to become the god of this world. But in order to level up, he needs to earn money and satisfy his needs. He thought about how to get money. The hero returns to Judy. Her boyfriend offers to treat her, but she refuses. After some time, the girl still wanted to buy food, but it was sold out, so the hero offered her his duck legs for 2.5 yuan. Judy thanks David for taking care of her. Suddenly, John runs up to them. The guy is outraged that the girl refused his treats and took food from this loser. The young lovers had a fight, and the guy, in a fit of rage, grabbed the hero and threw him onto the floor of the carriage. The protagonist gets up from the floor and declares that John is his ticket to a rich life. After some time, the hero is examined by a doctor who says that David, due to the injury he received, is now in a coma. David woke up. His offender began to reproach the hero for pretending and not receiving serious injuries. The hero remembered that John always solved his problems with his fists, which made the guy very angry. An angry young man threatens to kill the main character. Judy suddenly appears in shock from her boyfriend's actions and tries to reason with him. The girl runs up to David and calls the doctor to provide the boy with the necessary help. The hero tries to calm the girl down, saying that he feels fine, but immediately faints. After a while, a policeman is standing in the carriage, and the passengers explain to him about the incident that happened. A lawman arrests John, who is trying to justify his actions. The girl leans towards the hero to check his well-being, but gets too close, which greatly embarrasses David. The boy starts to bleed from his nose from excitement, but Judy thinks it's a consequence of the injury. Having reached the station, the girl accompanies the main character to the hospital. Judy thinks her boyfriend is crazy for attacking a stranger. The hero bumps into a young lady and compliments her, mentioning that she is the goddess of the second high school. She remembers this guy, and the hero is incredibly happy about it. David believes that he must train so that in the future, he will be able to stand up for himself and protect the girl who will be next to him. After some time, the hero woke up in a hospital room, believing that he was in heaven, because the goddess Judy was sitting next to him. The girl now wants to address him as a cool guy. The guy remembers that in his past life, he hardly communicated with this girl, and considers this a big mistake. Judy suggests that David exchange contacts on WeChat. The girl's father and John's parents enter the room. The boy's father and mother apologize to the hero for raising their son poorly. David, taking advantage of the situation, demands $100,000 in compensation from his abuser's parents. The boy's father agrees to pay any amount. The hero declares that he does not need money. He wants to show John what consequences his actions can lead to. John's father sincerely repents for what happened and promises to bring his son so that he can apologize to David. Everyone leaves. Judy's father tells his daughter that John will not bother her anymore and is interested in her relationship with the hero. The girl tells her father that she has no feelings for him and is not interested in him. At this time, David thinks about where to spend the huge amount of points he earned and decides to restore his good vision in order to get rid of his glasses and become more attractive. The hero gets out of bed and admires himself in the mirror for a long time, not believing that glasses had such a strong influence on his appearance. Judy sends the guy a message from the restaurant and offers to bring him some delicious food. The young people correspond for some time, which gives the girl's father a strange premonition. The next day, the girl brings the hero a popular novel. David thanks her for her concern. Judy notices that the guy has stopped wearing glasses, and this has made him much more attractive. The girl left. And later John appeared in the room, asking for forgiveness for his actions. The boy's father handed David an envelope with $100,000 in compensation. The hero already had more than $140,000, and he was thinking about where to spend such a large sum. Suddenly, Judy appeared in the room with her father and asked how the main character was feeling. The man says that he and his daughter will be leaving soon and came to say goodbye. The father sees a good guy in David and asks him to come visit him after he recovers. He also learns that the hero is studying at a university that is located near where his daughter studies, and asks him to look after her. The main character talks about his past and regrets that he didn't think about grades in the future, and now he regrets it very much. Judy's father believes that David will achieve great success in life with the money he received, and the man and his daughter leave. Judy waves goodbye to the hero and looks at him with a very warm look. Soon, David himself leaves the hospital and thinks about how to manage the money in order to make a big profit in the future. The hero arrives at a real estate office by bus and wants to buy a small apartment closer to the university. David signed a contract to buy an apartment that turned out to be much cheaper than he imagined. The main character comes to the apartment and cries with joy because he could never have afforded such a luxurious apartment in his past life. The hero decides to improve his appearance again by treating his bad teeth. But unfortunately, he can't do this because his attractiveness limit will be exceeded, and in order to increase it, David must improve to level 2. He puts too many points into himself at once and faints from it. The hero woke up and realized that with improved skills, he could achieve greater success. Suddenly, David receives a call from the university, warning him that if he does not show up for class soon, he will be expelled. The hero comes to the educational institution, and all the students admire his beauty, believing that he is new to the university. David enters the teacher's office, who is confused because he does not recognize his student. The teacher says that the hero's dorm is very noisy, to which David hands the manager an envelope with money and asks him to find a better place for him. The protagonist writes to Judy that he finally made it to the dorm. The girl asks the hero to take care of himself and his health, which the hero is very happy about, because no one has ever taken care of him like that. After this, the hero decides to go to the nearest supermarket for groceries. As he leaves the store, he meets a poor student who offers to buy a book from him. From this event, David gains the ability to improve his intelligence with the help of a holy book. The hero returns to the university and enters the classroom to introduce himself to his comrades. Many students admire his beautiful speech. Suddenly, David declares that if any girl in the class is interested in him, she can safely meet him in person. The hero sits down in his seat, and a crowd of girls immediately forms around him, wanting to get to know him. A very beautiful girl named Rachel comes up to the table and introduces herself as the group leader and offers to become friends on a social network. David asks her if she likes him, to which she calls him arrogant and states that she doesn't care about him at all. Suddenly, another beautiful girl runs up and sits down next to the hero, introducing herself as Tina. The girl tries to start a conversation with the main character, but he doesn't pay attention to her. This made Tina very angry, and she left, saying that the hero was simply using people who were beneficial to him. The students standing nearby do not understand how it was possible not to notice such a beautiful girl. To which the hero says that for him it is not appearance that is important, but character and intelligence. Evening comes and David decides to return to his room. There he is immediately met by an aggressive student who demands that he leave the room. The hero climbs onto his bed and takes a hammer out of his bag, which greatly frightens everyone in the room. The students are very afraid of David, considering him crazy, and want to escape from the room as soon as possible. Tina and her friend discuss the hero in the dining room, believing that he is from a very rich family since he behaves so impudently. David, who had just been exercising, enters the dining room. Suddenly, the same student who kicked him out of the room yesterday comes towards the hero. The hooligan's friends wish the hero a good morning, which shocks their friend. They introduce themselves as Ron and Mike and offer their help to the protagonist if he asks. David entered the elevator and met Rachel there. The hero admitted that she had an excellent figure. Suddenly, a strange guy puts his hand on the main character's shoulder and is surprised at how the hooligans from his room are afraid of the hero. David removed the stranger's hand from himself and returned his wallet, which, as it turned out, he had stolen. The hero enters the classroom and Rachel asks him what kind of friends he would like to make here. The protagonist says that he prefers people who don't ask stupid questions. But then Tina intervenes in the conversation and asks David to add her as a friend on WeChat. Rachel starts to get upset because the hero didn't respond to her message from yesterday. David claims that he was very busy, but the girl considers this a common excuse and takes offense. Rachel admits that the hero is very handsome but has an unbearable character and believes that she needs to stay away from him for a while. The girl turns her head and discovers that David will now be sitting next to her, which will ruin all her plans. The hero told Tina and Rachel that in the past he lacked the motivation to become better, but now he can fix everything. Tina seemed to believe the story, but the group leader did not and called David a pathetic liar. The girl said that the hero is just a loser who was dumped by his girlfriend, and now he is afraid to start a new relationship. The main character joked that Rachel, with such imagination, should start writing novels, which really embarrassed the girl. David remembered that in his past life, the girl was in a hurry and therefore allowed the hero to use her laptop, where he found her account on the site of authors of romantic novels. Rachel sat with her eyes downcast, not believing that the hero was able to reveal her secret. But he didn't even think about stopping, and now his goal was to find out about all her secrets. The bell rang and Tina invited the hero to go with them to the cafeteria, but David politely declined. In the evening, the hero walked to the hostel, thinking along the way that he needed to buy a computer and a new phone. Returning to the room, the hero greatly frightened the hooligan student with the sound of a hammer blow when he put his backpack on the floor. David left the room and admitted that it was quite funny to scare these idiots. The next day, the hero went to an electronics store and bought himself a new Apple phone. After this, David bought himself a laptop and got a new SIM card. For purchasing a SIM card, he was given the ability to make his number impossible to track, but most importantly, he can now intercept absolutely any calls. Tina discusses the hero with Rachel and says that she thinks he's quite cute. Rachel receives a text message from David asking her to add his new number to WeChat, but not to tell anyone about it. The girl noticed that the numbers in his number were similar to those of high-ranking officials and was very surprised. At this time, the hero tried in vain to find Rachel's group on the internet, but he was unsuccessful. After several attempts, David managed to stumble upon the girl's group. The hero began to fantasize that with the advent of the popularity of novels and Rachel's skills, they could succeed. Entering the auditorium, the hero was immediately called to her by Tina. David was very surprised, because in her past life she never took the initiative in communicating with guys. Rachel didn't pay any attention to the hero, and he realized that everything was going according to plan. He just needed to wait a little. Tina complains to the protagonist that he did not respond to her message, but the protagonist justifies himself by saying that he was very busy. Suddenly, a student named Alan starts bragging to his girlfriend that after graduating, he won't have to work because his parents are very rich, and his speech attracts many girls. Only the protagonist knows that this upstart's family is of average status. David does not understand how anyone could fall for this stupid trick. In his thoughts, the protagonist believes that Rachel is more interesting than anyone in the group. The girl notes in her head that the hero is good at everything and is very different from his peers. She really likes this. A verbal altercation ensues between David and another student, and the hero humiliates his opponent with a joke, causing Rachel to laugh, which is completely out of character for her. Alan decided to provoke the hero by offering him, while he was preparing for exams, to rent out one of the apartments of his supposedly rich parents. The main character didn't even look in the direction of this stupid upstart, which greatly impressed Rachel. The girl expressed confidence that David would easily pass all the exams, which greatly encouraged the hero. Alan decided to show that he was no worse than the hero, but he did not understand a single task, which made him very nervous. Rachel admitted that he was only capable of talking beautifully, but in reality, he was completely worthless. Alan's friend Brittany was puzzled by how smart David was to be able to handle such difficult material. Several more students approached the hero and asked him to help them pass an exam in the future. A hurt Alan consoles himself by believing that David will never be able to rise to his level. Rachel wanted Alan's self-admiration to turn into conflict so she could see the look on his face after he was defeated by the hero. David tries to put the arrogant guy in his place by mentioning that his family does not own large houses, but only a few apartments. Alan is furious because absolutely no one could have known this. The hero puts the student in a very awkward position by bombarding Alan with questions about the real estate his family owns. Rachel can't understand how David could know about her secrets and Alan's secrets. The student begins to panic as the hero tells him about his parents' affairs in all the details that only their son could know. David says he has information about all the students in his group. The bell rang and the teacher began a lecture on microeconomics. Rachel thinks that the hero was simply amazing, and no one in the world could have humiliated Alan like that by pointing out his place. The girl thought that she could write a novella where the main character would be David, But she immediately discarded this thought, blushing deeply. Rachel recognizes the hero as a real man and decides that she simply needs to get closer to him. After the end of the lesson, Tina invites the protagonist to have lunch with her and Rachel. The hero refuses, citing the fact that the canteen is too expensive for him. Tina, seeing his new phone, does not believe his words. But the hero declares that he spent all his money on it and now cannot even afford lunch at the university. The girl offers David to have lunch at her expense. The hero refuses again, citing the fact that he will not be able to return her money. But Tina convinces him that she just wants to treat him. David recalls his experiences playing dating sims and begins to guess the girl's true intentions. Tina grabs his hand and starts pulling him along with her, but the hero still agrees. Brittany and Rachel laugh at the girl, and the class leader remarks that she and David look pretty funny together. Tina is very confused by her best friend's words. The girl thinks that the hero is making fun of her and pinches his arm hard. Tina herself does not understand why she invites the hero to have lunch together. At this time, Brittany invites David to go to the cafeteria together. The hero politely refuses her offer because he doesn't like the food at the university. Brittany and Tina walked away, and the hero admitted that the girls were showing a strange interest in him. But he is absolutely indifferent to both girls, and he does not want to start a serious relationship with them. David also notes that Brittany only needs love, while Tina wants to get a rich husband and his wallet. The girls admit that they do not arouse any interest in the hero and believe that they are not good enough for him. Tina tries to invite David to lunch again, but Brittany intervenes and mentions that the girl has already spent all her money on skin cream and will not be able to pay for the hero. Tina catches the girl in a lie, claiming that she did not spend money on any cream. The girls look at each other angrily, as if they were about to start a duel. David looks at all this and cannot believe that the girls are arguing in order to feed him. The hero invites both girls to dinner so as not to offend anyone. Tina wonders why the main character bought himself such a cool phone, spending a significant amount of money. David explained that Rachel imagined that the hero was walking around with an old phone to remember his past girlfriend. Brittany wonders if the hero had a girlfriend. The hero says that he has never been in a relationship because he was a loser in school. Tina admits that she finds David rather shy for such a cute and confident guy. Suddenly, Brittany asks a very strange question, in which she asks what kind of girls the hero likes. All this time, Rachel was walking behind the trio and listening attentively to every word David said. The hero says that the girl of his dreams should not only be beautiful, but also gentle and understanding. Tina is not surprised that David has never had a girlfriend, as his ideas about love are quite simple. The girl also admits that the hero deserves the best girl in the world. David doesn't understand what qualities make a good girl. Tina states that it is all individual and that her most outstanding quality is her breasts. Brittany thinks that what matters is what David likes, and she can't figure out what's so special about her. Rachel is very annoyed by being a rival of Tina and Brittany, despite the fact that she does not have any feelings for the hero. The girl notices that her friends usually behave like children, but when they become rivals, they are ready to do anything just to show their best side. Tina takes the hero by the hand, which embarrasses David, and leads him to the dining room. The heroes were greeted by a variety of delicious food in the cafeteria, from fresh noodles to golden shrimp. Tina decided to buy some fruit for the main character and was already rushing to him to treat him. The girl was horrified to discover that David was missing and could not find him. The hero called out to the girls, holding a bag with a bunch of delicious cakes and other desserts in his hands. The girls immediately pounced on the sweets. They couldn't wait to try them. Rachel looked at her dessert for a long time and didn't seem to even want to eat it. David offered to give her portion to him, but the girl refused and began to gobble up the treat. The girls thanked the hero with all their hearts for such a delicious gift. Tina bought for the hero one of the most expensive dishes that could be found in the canteen. David offered Brittany to pay for his lunch tomorrow so as not to offend Tina. The girl happily agreed. Hot-tempered Tina declared that she would never treat Brittany again. Rachel noticed that the hero did not pay any attention to the girls' quarrel, deciding that they were not interesting to him at all. The hero offered the girl a slice of tangerine, but she was taken aback and politely declined. David in his head decided that Rachel was much better than Tina or Brittany. The hero returned to the dorm and entering the room found Ron there who was about to go to lunch. The main character asked if they would walk all night long again, to which he received a positive answer. Ron justified this by saying that the university campus, in his words, was too small and they were bored there. The hero understood that they would burn through their rich parents' money in nightclubs. David motivated himself by the fact that he now had to greatly surpass them in wealth. Ron suggested that the hero call him Ronnie as a sign of friendship, and told him that his parents were in the timber business, which brought in a good income. Another of David's neighbors introduced himself as Mike and said that his family runs an entire factory, and, as a sign of respect, offered the hero a cigarette. The protagonist politely declined, arguing that he cared about his health. Mike couldn't believe his ears and admitted that he smoked only for pleasure, to which the hero smiled sarcastically. David decided to create a friendly atmosphere because now they would live together, and friends should not have secrets. The hero admitted that he has very low self-esteem and feels like an introvert who does not like to interact with people. To cope with his problems, David read Buddhist scriptures. The hero asks Ron and Mike to take care of him and hopes to become good friends in the future. Ronnie was very embarrassed by the hero's last phrase and decided to leave the room, followed by Mike. Mike expressed to his friend his desire to move out of the room as soon as possible. But there were no more vacancies left at the university. Ron decided that David could be of great use to them, protecting them on their path to power. To do this, the guy decided to use Mike's sister to charm the hero and make him do whatever they needed. Mike reacted very rudely to this idea, but Ron admitted that it was just a stupid joke. The next day, in the cafeteria, Tina was unhappy with the behavior of the hero, who ate the lunch that Brittany bought for him. The hero apologized, and the hot-tempered girl, in her head, noted that David was a little rude but very reasonable, and she needed to get his attention. At this time, the protagonist noted that Tina and Brittany are quite funny and can help him get closer to Rachel. David didn't like his new life. Especially the fans who constantly followed him around irritated him. The holidays came and most of the students left the dormitory. Tomorrow, the holiday is supposed to start for those who stayed at the university. And on this occasion, arguments began in the chat between the guys and girls about how they should celebrate it. Head girl. Rachel tried her best to calm her comrades down. David recognized the girl's plight and decided to intervene in the dispute to help her. Rachel wrote to the hero, thanking him for his help and offering to pay for his ticket. The hero decided to check the website where the headman posted her romantic novels. He received a message, supposedly from Rachel, but the hero had to make sure of it, so he wrote to her, asking her to share her phone number. The next morning, David walked to the student meeting place, chatting on the phone with his parents. There he was already met by Tina, who was worried that the hero had arrived so late. The girl threw herself into David's arms, which greatly angered Brittany, who was standing nearby. The hero decided to calm the girls, who were ready to tear each other apart by offering to meet with the rest of the students. Rachel was the leader of the group, so she had the honor of being in charge of today's event. The student standing next to the hero muttered under his breath that the headman had beautiful legs. David agreed that Rachel had a great figure, which she achieved through regular exercise. The hero was so lost in his dreams that he came to his senses only when the headman called out to him. Rachel was very nervous because it was the first-class event, and she was supposed to be in charge of it. But the presence of the main character calmed her down a little. Suddenly, Alan decided to make a scene, declaring that he was already tired of walking and that this hike was not the best idea. One of the students decided to put this upstart in his place by pointing out the rather high price of a metro ride. An angry Alan accused the guy of bullying him. A verbal altercation ensued between the young people, as a result of which they were even ready to fight. Rachel couldn't believe that the conflict had occurred over such a stupid trifle. The girl simply lost her temper and began to sternly reprimand the hot-tempered students. Tina grabbed the hero by the hand and was afraid that a fight would start now. The girl started hugging David, which did not please Brittany, who was standing nearby. Now the hero was being held by both girls at once, which made him very embarrassed. David was not happy with the situation and asked his rivals to leave him alone. The girls let go of the main character, took offense at him, and went their separate ways. The hero turned his attention to Rachel, who was scolding Alan and another student. David noticed that the girl was looking at him, and in her gaze one could read a request for help. The guy decided to come to Rachel's rescue, but he tripped and fell to the floor. The hero, taken by surprise, urgently needed to go to the toilet, and he rushed there with all his might. Taking advantage of the fact that Rachel was distracted by the main character, the rowdy students decided to sort out their relationship again. The head girl scolded them and told all the students to go about their business and meet again in 2 hours. The students were shocked because the girl had never let her feelings out before. Sometime later, the hero was sitting under a tree in the park. Tina and Brittany wrote to him, offering to meet. David ignored them. Now he needed to get closer to Rachel. He decided to write to her. The girl walked past the cafe and reproached the hero for not helping her. She decided not to talk to him anymore. Rachel received a message asking her to help the main character with a certain problem. At first, the girl decided that she would never help this scoundrel, but she became interested in what he wanted from her. The hero decided to deceive the girl by saying that he had a stomach ache and forgot to take toilet paper with him. The headman was shocked by this story. However, Rachel believed this story and decided that now the hero was in her hands, because no one but her could pull him out of the toilet. The girl made a condition that she would fulfill David's request if he asked her correctly. The hero called her madam, mistress, and even dear, which made the girl furious. Rachel decided that David was not capable of saying even a few beautiful words to make a girl happy. Suddenly, a very familiar voice called out to her from behind. It was David, who brought some delicious ice cream to treat the girl. Rachel pretended not to even notice him and sat down on the nearest bench. The hero sat down next to her and asked her to get some ice cream, mentioning that he stood in line for it. David joked that he bought himself some toilet paper and urgently needed to run to the toilet. The girl blushed with embarrassment, apparently not realizing that it was just a joke. The protagonist stated that if Rachel didn't start eating the ice cream right now, he would have to force it into her mouth. The girl took the ice cream anyway and asked if the hero had washed his hands. David joked that there was no need to do so since he hadn't touched anything like that. Unexpectedly, Rachel burst into laughter at this joke, and the hero was delighted by this. The girl put her hand on David's shoulder, which made him very embarrassed. Rachel noticed that the hero was always smiling and trying his best to make her happy, and he aroused her interest. The girl admitted that her words about the main character being absolutely indifferent to her were a lie. Now she intends to give this guy a chance. The hero has discovered a new skill, thanks to which he will now be able to better communicate with girls and win their attention. David asked the girl what she tasted in the ice cream, but the girl seemed to have gone crazy. She stood up from the bench to attack the hero, but the running girl crashed into her with all her might. The girl began to fall to the ground from the blow, but the hero managed to catch her at the very last moment. David warned Rachel that there were a lot of children there and asked her to be careful. The girl complained that there were too many weirdos in their class and it was hard for her to cope with them all. Rachel asked the protagonist to help with classroom management. David advised the girl not to pay attention to stupid conflicts because they cannot be avoided, but rather to focus on meaningful goals. The head woman admired the boy's way of thinking, his inner strength and foresight. The girl said that she would follow David's advice and one day become much better than him. The hero wished the girl good luck, but she was outraged that he said this to her in a tone as if he were talking to a child. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Tina appeared, who had been trying to find Rachel all this time. The girl was perplexed when she saw David next to her friend, apparently deciding that the hero had feelings for her. Worried, Tina approached her friend, who was not very happy with her sudden appearance. Rachel threw the ball of paper into the trash can and her friend hugged her. Tina said that she couldn't get through to her for a long time. The headman looked at her kindly and suggested going to the elephant exhibition. The protagonist put his finger to his nose, watching the two girls who radiated youth and charm. Suddenly, David froze, realizing that Brittany should be at this exhibition right now. Tina turned to him and suggested that they go see the elephants together. But to her surprise, she did not find the guy. It was as if he had disappeared. Tina was a little surprised by this turn of events. Rachel decided to call the hero. After a few seconds, David slowly and hesitantly took his phone out of his pocket and answered. The indignant headman demanded an explanation from him regarding his sudden disappearance. The guy said that he needed to finish some things and offered the girl to help him. These words completely enraged Rachel. She refused and rudely called the main character names. When the head woman hung up, her friend asked what the couple had been doing there. She seemed not to notice her question, and cursing David, quickly moved forward. A little later, the hero sent Judy a photo of a monkey from the zoo. She really wanted to visit there. The girl smiled and suggested that they definitely spend time together during the next holidays. The main character looked at his phone and thought about how kind and sweet this girl was. He glanced at his smartphone screen again and noticed that it was almost 5 p.m., so he should hurry to his classmates. Meanwhile, two students started arguing about the restaurant where they would have dinner, which made Rachel very angry. Soon, out of nowhere, David appeared and suggested that everyone take a stroll down Snack Street. Tina raised her hand, recognizing his solution to the dispute as excellent, and the other students also agreed. A little later, the red-haired girl was looking at a small souvenir shop. The hero was sipping soda from his glass. Tina tried on cute bunny ears and suggested that David do the same, but he refused. The main character suggested that the girl join his friends, because it was much more fun with them than with him. She turned around and refused, citing the fact that the guy would be bored without her. Suddenly, Tina grabbed David's hand and dragged him along to visit some interesting places. Soon, during a walk, the red-haired girl pressed herself against the window of one of the buildings. Behind the glass, she saw an incredibly beautiful necklace. Then the main character remembered a moment from his past life when Tina disdainfully treated the same necklace that he gave her. The girl turned to the guy and suggested going inside the store. While she was examining the decoration, David casually sipped his soda and looked at her. Tina, as if bewitched, looked at the necklace that she had never worn in her past life. The hero was very surprised that she liked the decoration that she had previously despised. The guy exhaled and smiled, realizing the absurdity of the situation. Suddenly, David approached the checkout and agreed to buy a necklace for Tina. With this, he wanted to mark the end of an era of his past life. The girl was surprised by the main character's generosity and promised to brag about it to Brittany. Then the guy threatened to refuse the purchase. He didn't like his girlfriend's idea. Unexpectedly, after paying for the purchase, David received a new notification. The system informed him about the bonus that was due for such a large expenditure of money. As a reward, he received a pet leash that increases the obedience and happiness of the pet wearing it. The main character regretted that he didn't have a husky, and at that very second, Tina called out to him. The red-haired girl smiled sweetly and asked the guy to help her put on the necklace she had just bought. David called himself quite clumsy, but agreed to his friend's request. When he finished decorating, he heard a strange sound outside the store. The hero's eyes widened when he saw several of his classmates outside the window. Among them was Rachel, who was clearly unhappy with what was happening. Cold sweat ran down David's face, since the headman most likely misinterpreted what he saw. The guy clenched his fist and finally decided to take action. He plucked up his courage and smiling, headed straight towards the headman. After this, the main character waved to the girl and asked what she and Brittany were doing here. The green-haired student smirked. They were gathering the whole group. She was interested in what the guy and Tina were doing here. The girl smiled and said that they were going to join the group. Soon Rachel announced the end of today's event, asking all students to disperse. Some students were dissatisfied with the rather boring pastime. The main character noticed a couple in love discussing the day. David adjusted his hair and realized that he would never have a better moment. The boy looked at Rachel carefully, thinking about loneliness. The headman and Tina were having a nice time together, having a lively conversation. He headed to the dorm, thinking that he now needed to focus on his career and money. A few minutes later, the hero returned to his room and finally decided to relax. To his surprise, Rachel responded to him on the website and wrote her number, which made him incredibly happy. Meanwhile, the girl was in her room and received a friend request from one of the readers, who was David. The headmistress accepted him. She was glad that her work was enjoying at least a little popularity. In addition, the main character sent Rachel a small virtual gift. This slightly infuriated the girl. She threw her phone aside. The guy soon found out that she didn't want to finish her novel because she was unhappy with the current content, and he put his hands behind his head. David thought about how to help a budding author overcome creative block and achieve success in the future. After a few seconds, he realized that the girl was focusing too much on the writing style, rather than the plot and characters. Soon, Rachel received a message in which her new friend pointed out all the problems that were preventing her writing from developing. She realized that the person on the other side of the smartphone knew her stories almost perfectly, which surprised her greatly. The girl said that his messages make her happy, so she asked the reader to write more advice for the development of the work. This made David laugh a little because even an ordinary stranger from the internet could help a girl. He grabbed his chin and decided to help his friend, since he had a pumped-up writing and literature skill. Immediately after this, the main character wrote to her and pointed out the girl's lack of general knowledge about life. The headman read his advice as if spellbound. He wrote about the absence of important details in the novel. The guy also said that only a few readers can be touched by history, and the girl was amazed by the accuracy of his conclusions. Rachel's face turned red with embarrassment. She had finally found someone who appreciated her work. She asked her new friend to help her solve the problems of her novel. The guy flexed his fingers. After that, he crossed his arms and realized that he could finally begin his cooperation with the headman. That same evening, Tina was getting ready to go to bed, but her neighbor was engaged in a heated correspondence with the hero. David sat at the computer and carefully studied every message he received from her. The girl lacked experience in writing romance novels, so the guy suggested that she choose a direction in which she was well-versed. Rachel thought about it. The hero took a sip of coffee from his mug, and his interlocutor replied that she was very good at portraying female bodies. Hearing this, the main character almost choked on his coffee and spat it out. Soon he put his hand to her chin. The guy did not even suspect about such a strange hobby of the girl. Suddenly, Tina noticed her friend. She became incredibly curious about who she was texting with. David asked Rachel if she wanted to continue her career, and she said yes. In fact, she had no other choice. Her eyes showed it. The main character sadly realized that the girl either needs to open her own business or marry a rich guy in order to stay afloat. The guy remembered his girlfriend's desire to become a model, but unfortunately, nothing came of it. Suddenly, Rachel had an idea to write a novel about a domineering CEO. He should be an insanely handsome but cold-blooded tycoon, and the main character should be a sweet, good-natured girl. This couple is supposed to meet by chance on a train, and after a series of coincidences, feelings will appear between them. There will also be a conflict between the hero and the girl's father, whose companies compete with each other, after which the man ends up in prison. The director becomes increasingly cruel and ruthless, paying no attention to the people around him. Then the girl's sister sacrifices herself and makes an agreement with the hero. The heroine goes through a transformation from an ordinary, cheerful girl to a cruel and cold-blooded semblance of a director. She soon returns to the protagonist, feigns submission, and begins to implement her plan for revenge. Rachel sent the story to David, her expression showing excitement. The girl looked at the phone screen for a while, waiting for an answer from the guy. The next morning, he went to the library and took a rather thick book that would help him develop the skill of speed reading. Suddenly, he noticed Rachel standing by the bookshelf and greeted her. Soon, the guy helped the girl get the book she needed from the top shelf. The hero asked her about writing a novel, and a dissatisfied Rachel replied that she wanted to find a new hobby. The guy suggested that the girl take up short stories, but she hurried away. David smiled, waved after her, and wished her luck. Soon, Rachel returned to her room and put the book she had taken on the table. She picked up the phone. Yesterday's interlocutor offered her to finish his own project because the girl wrote beautifully and well. He also allowed her to become partners. She will be able to receive 1/3 of all profits. The guy will send her the first 3 chapters so that she can make a final decision. The headman was looking forward to this moment. Suddenly, Rachel clenched her fist and decided to surpass David at all costs. A few minutes later, the main character was already walking through the university, holding the drafts of the novel under his arm. He shook his head and decided that writing a successful work would bring him a lot of money, which would go towards upgrading the system. 3 days later, Rachel finally received the coveted message that she had completed work on the first 3 chapters of the novel. Tina told her friend about her departure, promising to bring a bunch of goodies with her. Soon the headman began to study the script sent by the main character. Suddenly, the writer noticed that the heroine had the same last name as she did. After reading the entire document, the girl was amazed by the story of the novel. The main character of the work is very eloquent and precise, which allows him to easily deal with all his opponents. Rachel felt that the heroine's actions and reactions were not entirely appropriate, but did not interfere with the story at all. Soon she wrote to the guy that she agreed, but only for a good fee. David was pleased with her answer. His demands on the writer would be very serious. As a test before work, he asked Rachel to write a passionate scene between the characters. She was very surprised by such a request. She looked at the laptop screen in amazement, doubting the true intentions of her interlocutor. A few seconds later, David received consent, but the headman suggested changing the heroine's surname. He smiled. The guy refused, which greatly angered the aspiring writer. Frustrated, Rachel agreed to write a draft of the novel and set to work. A few days later, David received a result that made him blush with embarrassment. Despite this, he praised the work of the headman, who was incredibly happy about it. Suddenly, the guy offered the girl to sign a contract. She froze, holding the smartphone in her hands. The girl began to nervously bite her nails, because this would lead to the disclosure of their personalities and appearance. But if the novel was successful, it would bring her an impressive amount of money. David started typing. He suggested that they get to know each other better, so that they could start trusting each other. This option suited Rachel perfectly, so she happily agreed. The hero finally got up from his chair. He needed to prepare a few more drafts and upload them. The guy hadn't left his room for several days. There was a lot of trash in the trash can, and he decided to throw it out. As David leaned toward the urn, he felt a strange movement behind him. Mike and Ron entered the room holding several large bags. The couple couldn't find their friend anywhere, which made them worried. Ron turned his attention to the main character sitting near the trash can. David turned to his neighbors with his pale, sleep-deprived face. Ron and Mike grabbed each other and began to scream hysterically. The puzzled hero looked at them with bewilderment. The 2 students froze in place. The main character stood holding a garbage bag in his hands. Soon, Mike finally pressed the switch and turned on the light in the room. David stared at his neighbors in amazement, not understanding why they didn't move on. The big guy was afraid to look at the guy and decided that the package contained what was left of their missing friend Louis. The surprised hero could not believe such nonsense, so he showed them a small bag of ordinary garbage. Soon the guy's neighbors came inside. Ron asked him to contact them in the future, because they would be happy to do his job. Mike sat down on his bed and, opening his bag, told the protagonist that he had brought a bunch of different food. After that, he threw David a bag of food that was made in his family's factory. Within a few moments, the boy was happily devouring the chicken leg that he had been given. Mike promised to ask his parents to send him more of these goodies, and Ron said he had a gift too. He then dumped on the table a pile of various foods that could only be found in his hometown. The big guy threw David several packages of snacks, which surprised him greatly. He was glad of the generosity of his neighbors, but asked them not to give him everything because he was not at all hungry. But Ron and Mike insisting that the boy had to try all the snacks. The hero thanked them, noting that they had become too kind to him. Soon the couple began to discuss their trips among themselves. David could not believe that such grown-up guys were afraid of him, like little children. The main character was deep in thought. His neighbors could cause him a lot of trouble if they weren't afraid of him. He observed his pseudo-friends, noticing that Louis had greatly influenced their characters, as he was used to getting his way only through intimidation. Ron noticed that David was looking at him for a long time, so he turned and asked what was wrong. The guy calmed the big guy down and asked when Louis would return. The couple looked at him gloomily and were stunned, deciding that he wanted to get even with their friend. Ron began to distract the hero while Mike wrote warnings to his friend, advising him not to return to the dorm. David looked closely at the couple and asked them to calm down. After that, he covered himself with his blanket and offered to treat his generous neighbors tomorrow. The guys were afraid of the main character's wrath, so they agreed almost immediately. The next evening, the three of them went into town and sat at a table enjoying a barbecue. David took out his phone and offered his friends to order fried rice. And at the same time, he decided to treat the rest of his friends in the future, in order to thank them for their kindness. Suddenly, the guy noticed a stranger in front of him and looked up from his phone screen. Soon, he saw two beautiful girls. One of them approached Mike. The guy jumped up from his chair and greeted them happily. They were just looking for a place for dinner. Ron and the hero discussed the unexpected guests, one of whom was the beauty of the entire university. Meanwhile, Mike invited the girls to join them. One of them asked her friend for permission, making cute eyes. Soon there were 5 of them. They drank alcohol and chatted happily. A little later, the big guy introduced the main character to a girl named Ruby, who was the head of the finance class. Next, David met the university's most beautiful girl, Nancy, who waved sweetly at him. Ron was about to introduce the hero to the guests, but when he started speaking, he choked on his beer. Not wanting to spoil the first impression of himself, David introduced himself to the girls. Ruby froze when she heard his name. It sounded very familiar to her. A few seconds later, she punched her palm, realizing who exactly was sitting in front of her. Then the girl reminded the guy of Brittany and Tina, who were competing with each other, trying to win his attention. And he turned pale. The main character froze, cold sweat running down his face. Mike and Ron looked at their neighbor and simultaneously called him cool for being able to make 2 female students compete. The boys started asking David all sorts of questions about it, and suddenly Nancy coughed into her hand. The beauty finally suggested that her friends order some food. Ron said that David was paying for the food today, so the girls could order whatever they wanted, and beads of sweat rolled down the hero's face again. Ruby called this wrong and suggested that everyone split the bill between themselves. Despite this, the main character picked up the menu and, looking at the girls, insisted that he would pay for the entire order. Judy and Nancy exchanged nervous glances, struck by the boy's generosity. A few seconds later, the finance class leader grabbed the menu to choose her dinner for tonight. Mike walked up to his girlfriend and showed her the most delicious items on the menu. All this time, David watched the university beauty, not believing that she knew his neighbor. Previously, the main character had heard many rumors about her, but now Nancy was sitting nicely with him at the same table. The guy took a sip of beer from his tin can and was suddenly called out by a beauty. She said that she does not tolerate alcohol well, but still thanked the hero for his generosity. He suggested that she relax, and a moment later they clinked their beer cans. Finally, the order was brought. The big guy immediately picked up the tongs. At that moment, David and Nancy's eyes met. The guy's attention was drawn to her insanely beautiful eyes, combining blue, purple, and light blue colors. The girl pointed to her unusual eyes and said she inherited them from her mother, who belongs to an ethnic minority. The main character raised his finger up, calling them very unusual and beautiful. Nancy took a sip from her can and asked where David was from. Hearing about the City of Dreams, she looked down. A lot of minerals were mined there. The beauty talked to him about the scenery of this place, but did not look at him. Suddenly, Mike nudged the hero and pointed him towards Rachel, who was standing not far from them. A concerned David called out to his friend, and everyone looked at her. Ruby was very surprised to recognize the girl as the head of the finance class. Nancy froze and looked at Rachel strangely. She looked at the girl sitting at the table, a bead of sweat rolling down her face. Rachel was not only a class monitor but also a member of the student council, dreaming of developing her literary skills and achieving higher positions. Nancy was an ordinary student who was absolutely indifferent to the affairs of the university and dreamed of starting her studies abroad. The girls theoretically shouldn't cross paths, but despite this, they glared at each other. The head girl said that it was a surprise for her to meet the university beauty. Rachel's eyes grew scary as she said the position of vice principal had been left open for a freshman. She said that the man refused, so the position was given to her. The students at the table seemed to ignore her. The freshman who turned down the offer was Nancy. She smirked. Rachel then looked at David with disdain, not understanding why he was sitting at the same table with the university beauty. A few seconds later, the head girl asked the hero why he wasn't in the dorm, since Tina was waiting for him there. The guy was embarrassed. He excitedly replied that he was simply entertaining his roommates when Ruby and Nancy happened to meet them. David also suggested that she come later and pick up the food that he would order for her. The girl at the table tensed up. Rachel gave the guy a disapproving look that was starting to be scary. Ruby almost jumped out of her seat, realizing that something interesting was about to begin. Suddenly, Ron stood up from his chair and asked the waiter to bring another chair for the new customer. The big guy asked the main character to move over and make room for the head man, who felt very uncomfortable. David's neighbor invited Rachel to sit at the same table with them. Mike grabbed his face with his hand. The main character was ashamed that he could have problems. The guy turned to Ron and, smiling madly, warned him about an important conversation that would take place this evening. The big guy with the phone in his hands looked at his neighbor with fear. Soon, the unexpected guest finally took a chair in her hand and began to approach the table. A chill ran down the boy's spine as he looked at the disgruntled Nancy and Rachel. David sat nervously in place, not at all imagining how events would develop. Suddenly, the main character called out to his friend and said that they had already eaten almost everything. The headman looked at him. The guy suggested inviting her next time. He also smiled sweetly and advised that they meet more often so that everyone could get to know each other better. Suddenly, Rachel flared up and walked away angrily. Everyone looked at her in bewilderment. Ron called the protagonist's girlfriend crazy, and he noticed it anyway. Meanwhile, the head woman was very upset, because no one had ever rejected her so rudely. Suddenly, bitter tears appeared in the saddened girl's eyes. Rachel instantly wiped them away with her sleeve, insulting the main character in the process. At this time, Ron asked David if he and this girl really were in the same class. Surprised, Ruby said that the boys lived in the same dorm with the headmen. Mike scratched the back of his head in shame, thinking about how the hero constantly scared them and didn't allow them to ask questions. Nancy looked after the departing girl. She felt a little sorry for her. Ron, eating his kebab, said that it wasn't so bad since the prefect and David didn't get along very well with each other. Ruby called Rachel a pretty nice person, and the two often crossed paths in the student council. Nancy put her jar on the table and stated that this girl likes to dominate, which is why the students don't get along well with her. The big guy took a sip of beer. In his opinion, no one could cope with the headman's character. The protagonist ate a small portion of shashlik and replied that she had no problems with Rachel. He considered the girl to be too young, and everyone present looked at him in bewilderment. Mike, Ruby, and Nancy were thrilled to hear such a profound thought from their classmate. The university beauty looked at the guy sweetly. His voice was very similar to her father's voice. She smiled and said that people have many facets that make them better. The main character suggested that his friends finally continue eating. David went to the toilet, asking his friends to order a portion of fried rice for him before leaving. In fact, he was texting Rachel, who was complaining about him. The guy advised her to get closer to him, because he was ideal for the role of the prototype of the novel's hero. At the same time, he was upset that the headman considered him cold and unpleasant. A little later, Rachel went into a small diner and ordered some fried rice. The girl promised her interlocutor never to cross paths with David again, which he was not particularly happy about. Soon, the main character warned his friends that he needed to leave for a while, but they could continue to enjoy the food. He then left Ron his wallet, which his friends could use to pay for the order if he was delayed. Mike and Nancy looked at David in surprise as he ran away with the bag in his hands. Rachel asked for eggs in her rice, while contemplating the idea of making her abuser the villain of a short-lived romance. The main character agreed with her, but asked her not to consider the real David a vile and disgusting person. The girl looked thoughtfully at the smartphone screen. A stranger from the internet helped her calm down. The cook finally handed the headman the bag of fried rice she had ordered. Rachel began to rummage through her pockets for her wallet, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, a strange guy handed the seller a banknote and offered to pay for it. It was none other than David, holding a bag of rice from the establishment he had just been to. He suggested that the headman take it, because the rice in this eatery is not the most delicious and healthy. These words made the cook angry. Rachel was also not too happy with the appearance of her offender. Soon she thanked the guy through clenched teeth, trying to contain her true emotions. The girl then headed towards the exit, leaving her order for David, since he had paid for it. A few moments later, the hero took another bag of fried rice. His classmate's behavior seemed very strange to him. Perhaps it was connected with the recent meeting with Nancy. On his way to his friends, he read messages from Rachel, who was complaining about him again. The writer headed to the dorm to continue working on her novel, which earned David a couple thousand points. The whole way the guy thought about the girl's hypocrisy. She didn't want anyone to approach her without her personal permission. Soon he was happily greeted by Mike. The main character decided to help Rachel realize her mistakes. This should help her avoid serious problems in the future. The guy with glasses said that they were about to leave. David supported their decision. Ron started pestering him with questions about another package his friend had brought. Mike almost instantly closed his mouth so as not to provoke the hero. The girls also decided to go their separate ways, and Ruby said a sweet goodbye to the students. Ron and David waved back, suggesting they get together again in the future. A little later, the protagonist's neighbors were going on a date with girls from the drama academy, so they invited him to go with them. Mike fixed his hair and said that they would have a great time at the local karaoke. Hearing this, David immediately hinted to his friends that the students only wanted to have fun at their expense. Mike hit himself in the forehead, considering his friend too straightforward, while Ron was amazed by his ability to foresee the future. The hero explained that the guys are simply stupid and rich, which is an ideal opportunity for the girls to have a free vacation. David politely declined, the jock insisting on the offer while his friend fixed his hair with spray. The guy replied that he was not at all interested in finding a girlfriend right now. Ron covered his nose with the edge of his t-shirt so as not to smell the product that Mike used, while offering to help the hero choose a girlfriend. He refused again and headed to his workplace, suggesting that his neighbors first choose the girls from the class themselves. The big guy responded in fear that he wouldn't be able to handle such beauties on his own, and Mike supported him. Soon David advised his friends to hurry to the date, while he himself would focus on his studies. A few seconds later, the door to the room slammed shut very quickly, and the guys were gone without a trace. After this, the main character, turning on the computer, thought about the upcoming stock trading competition. He peered at the monitor, realizing that the winner of this event would receive a whopping $150,000. The guy needed to practice his business skills, because all these funds must be invested in a business, the income from which the participant will receive. Rachel finally sent him her new work, which was over 100,000 words long. Then David remembered the mysterious conflict between the headman and Nancy. Their images appeared before him. He crossed his arms. The beauty had grown up in wealth, so he wouldn't be able to communicate with her now. He would have to accept the natural course of events. The next day, Brittany happily greeted the hero in the audience. They hadn't seen each other for a whole week. The girl sat down next to him and advised the guy to spend more time outside and have fun, but he had too much to do. He glanced at his self-help book. David was running out of time to rest. Then Brittany smiled slyly and reminded him of yesterday's dinner with the university beauty. The main character seemed to be not himself and asked his girlfriend to stop immediately. The guy decided that Tina had influenced the girl, which is why she became so talkative, but she denied everything. The green-haired girl also asked David about his recent fight with Rachel, and he choked on the unexpected question. Brittany said she came back to the dorm yesterday feeling very gloomy, so they asked her friend about what happened. The head woman coldly told about the meeting with David. Tina seemed to have gone crazy, so the green-haired girl was very scared and did not ask about anything else. The main character froze. He could not believe that such a good-natured girl considered him disgusting. Soon the guy told his friend about the dinner last night. He didn't invite Rachel to join, so she was upset. After hearing this story, Brittany was a little surprised, expecting a serious conflict between the hero and her friend. The girl spread her hands in displeasure, clearly expecting more, and then asked why David hadn't invited Rachel to the table. The guy glanced at his neighbor and replied that he was not ready to fulfill her every whim. A moment later, Tina and Rachel entered the room. Brittany asked the main character about his feelings for the red-haired girl. He had none. The two girlfriends immediately noticed David chatting with the green-haired student. Soon the class president walked past him, looking at the boy with displeased eyes. After the lesson, Brittany offered to treat the hero, but he planned to treat everyone who was kind to him. The girl immediately chose a treat for herself. David asked her to ask the others about the choice of dish. The first thing she did was approach Rachel. The guy hoped that the head girl had finally realized the mistakes of her behavior yesterday. Tina was incredibly happy with the main character's generous offer. Rachel sat with a displeased look. Soon all three girls were sitting at a table in a cafe. The upset headmistress chose the same thing as her friends. Looking at the menu, the head woman remembered David's actions yesterday, and in the end she decided to repay him in full. Suddenly, three female students were called out by guys sitting at the next table and asked to join them. Rachel politely declined, infuriated by the stranger's persistence. Then the main one approached the girls' table and asked where they studied. The headman gave him a disapproving look and rudely asked him to leave them alone. Alarmed, Tina immediately ordered Brittany to call the protagonist. Suddenly, another guy approached the green-haired student, offering to share his number with her. David didn't answer the call, so Rachel began to chase the strangers away, insulting them along the way. Then she threatened to call the police. The leader of the guys already put his hand on Tina's shoulder. He didn't see anything strange in this. A nasty smile adorned his face, and the headman clenched his hand into a fist. Suddenly, the stranger grabbed her by the hand and ordered her not to resist. The girl screamed. At that very moment, the main character appeared inside, clearly unhappy with this state of affairs. Brittany and Tina turned to their friend. They were incredibly happy to see him. The stranger was still holding Rachel, calling David lucky to be hanging out with such beautiful girls. Then this nasty guy started asking the hero which of them was his girlfriend. After this, the impudent fellow looked at the frightened headman. He was impatient to get to know her better. Suddenly, the main character called out to the guy, who threw an agitated glance at him. Within moments, an angry David grabbed the stranger by the hand with which he was holding the unfortunate Rachel. The nasty guy ordered him to be released immediately. The hero was not going to do this. Then he squeezed the stranger's hand hard, and he winced in pain. Soon the scoundrel's hand was torn from David's grip. The guy looked coldly into the face of the impudent man who was pestering his girlfriends. The main character gloomily ordered the nasty guy to never pester strange girls again. He pointed his finger at David and stated that he thought he could meet any girl he wanted. A moment later, the scoundrel's fist was heading towards the hero's face. The guy managed to stop the enemy's hand, and with one precise movement moved it to the side. A few seconds later, David had the stranger on the floor, his eyes filled with rage. The main character flexed his fingers. He was just defending himself and his friends. The stranger's friends looked in fear at their comrade, who was still lying on the floor of the establishment. Suddenly, an excited Ron burst into the cafe having received a call. David quickly headed for the exit, advising his friends to do the same. The guy didn't want them to be surrounded by curious glances, so he suggested going to another restaurant, and the girls hurried to the exit. A little later, Tina expressed her admiration for the hero's actions to Brittany, then asked her to be quieter, because she was afraid of those guys returning. Meanwhile, David walked with the headman and asked how she felt after what happened. The girl replied that she was fine, stroking the hand that the stranger had grabbed. There was suddenly an awkward silence between the protagonist and Rachel. The headman was annoyed that David had asked her only one question. Suddenly, the guy distracted her from her thoughts by calling his blow pretty cool. He then pointed his finger at Rachel, the hero considering what had happened to be a typical case from romance novels, when a prince saves a girl in distress. She looked at him again with displeasure, surprised that David apparently knew about her passion for writing romantic stories. The guy looked up and admitted that he wouldn't mind giving those hooligans a good beating. Then he closed his eyes and plunged into his thoughts. Such an act would be reckless, because real life is not at all like romance novels. Soon the guy said that he left the cafe so as not to expose the girls to even greater danger. This amazed the headman. In fact, David was a friend of the owner of that restaurant, so the hooligans would soon be detained thanks to the camera footage. Rachel was happy. When night fell, the main character changed his clothes and wrote to the headman again. She told him about the courage he had shown today, and he was surprised by the girl's sudden change of heart. Then David asked Rachel about her feelings towards him. She was very surprised, because she didn't like the guy at all. Finally, the protagonist informed the writer that he planned to start publishing their novel tomorrow, so she needed to make any changes to the text now, if she had any. Suddenly, Tina asked her friend about the stranger with whom she was texting every evening. She also, smiling sarcastically, pointed out the girl's strange behavior which appeared after she began communicating with him. The disgruntled headman told Tina that he was just her friend and that they were not in a love relationship. Soon Rachel got dressed and got ready to go to the library. The neighbors were surprised because it was quite late. A few seconds later, the door to the room slammed loudly, signaling the girl's departure. The headman's friends began to discuss her strange and mysterious behavior. The next day, the lecturer was telling his students about the importance of studying the financial system. Almost not a single student in the entire auditorium was listening to him. At this time, the aspiring writer was looking at the screen of the smartphone lying on her lap. It opened a page of the site with various novels. The girl finally published her recently written story. Rachel was incredibly proud of her work, her face slightly flushed with excitement. Then she remembered yesterday's evening correspondence with the main character, who asked the headman about changing the hero's name to David. The guy advised the writer to observe him more, because this would make the character in the novel even more realistic. Suddenly, Rachel heard the lecturer's voice calling out to one of the students. All those present turned to the main character. In front of him stood his laptop. The teacher asked why he needed it now. The guy got nervous and froze. The man adjusted his glasses and asked David to take his studies more seriously. Soon, all the students began to discuss the hero's actions. They were amazed, because he was usually very keen on studying. The guy realized his mistake and turned pale. In his past life, Lecturer Thomas asked students to bring laptops, but only at the next lesson. David quickly put the gadget away and explained that he was just preparing for an upcoming financial competition. Suddenly, one of the students laughed and called the hero a brazen liar. The teacher asked the boy if he was involved in real stock trading. He was afraid to answer. Because his income increased by 30%, it would sound incredible. Finally, David raised his hand and answered Thomas, saying that he was using a practice account that did not contain real money. The lecturer asked the guy some more questions about his financial training. He listed all the benefits of a practice account with a smile on his face. Thomas rubbed his chin and called the protagonist a very ambitious and capable student. Suddenly, the teacher asked him a question about trading models. If he answered correctly, he would get a good grade and be exempt from the remaining classes in the semester. Otherwise, he would lose his points. The guy tensed up. The students whispered among themselves, discussing the unenviable situation in which David found himself. One of them didn't believe in David's abilities. Brittany hoped for the best. Tina asked the headman what Thomas had asked the hero about. The red-haired girl admitted with annoyance that if he screwed up, then they would laugh at her and Brittany because they were chasing after such a loser. Rachel reassured her friend that in her opinion, Lecturer Thomas would never allow his students to disgrace themselves. Meanwhile, David cleared his throat and prepared to answer a rather difficult question. Within moments, he began a confident monologue in which he described all the intricacies of trading models. All the students, including Tina and the head teacher, listened to him attentively, as if bewitched. After the main character finished answering, the teacher began to applaud him. Surprisingly, almost no one present understood David as he used complex financial terms. Suddenly, the lecturer announced that he was giving the guy 95 points for the exam in advance, and he didn't even have to write it. The protagonist stood up from his seat and asked Thomas to let him earn these things on his own. He also asked the teacher not to cancel the promised points in case of his failure. Rachel considered the guy's behavior very arrogant. The lecturer promised to definitely fulfill the request of his most talented student. David bowed to Thomas. He was incredibly pleased with himself. The guy scratched his neck and decided to try giving a short lecture to his classmates. Soon the hero was standing at the huge green board, looking at those present in the audience. After that, he began a rather boring story about the basic rules of capital. Rachel watched David closely, her face clearly expressing her displeasure at his narcissism. The main character took the chalk and twirled it in his hands, while talking about his desire to meet with the same enthusiasts as himself. The guy glanced around the room again and began to explain trading patterns. A few minutes after he began his story, most of the students sat in bewilderment, not understanding almost a single word. David turned around again. He didn't like the fact that people who didn't understand anything about it had come to the finance class. While all the students, including Tina, were bored, Rachel was interestedly writing down every word the hero said. Among all the students, a quiet guy named Sam stood out, who was going to cover the upcoming financial competition. There was also a girl with glasses named Claire, who was quite brave and educated. After a few minutes, David finally finished his lecture and looked around the audience. After this, he gave an inspirational speech to his classmates, wishing them success in their future endeavors. Thomas stood to the side and admired one of the most talented students he had ever met in his life. The hero also pointed his finger upward and added that his comrades had a better understanding of finances than the average person. Rachel and Tina watched his train of thought in surprise. Finally, the guy finished his speech, but absolutely none of the students reacted to it in any way. He felt uncomfortable. Suddenly, everyone present began to praise the main character. Some of them even climbed onto their tables. David raised his hand and, smiling, thanked his classmates for their support. At this time, Ruby came to the main beauty of the university and reminded her of her recent meeting with the main character. She also said that Louis's face was very pale and scared when he moved out of his room. The girl sat down next to Nancy and expressed her suspicion about David's involvement in this. Ruby's friend did not agree with her conclusions, and the head girl decided to continue observing the hero. The girl with the bob looked at the beauty. The guy was reserved and was not at all embarrassed by her charming appearance. Nancy called him quite interesting, but she didn't understand why Ruby suddenly started talking about him. The head girl began to tell a story about an incident that recently happened in Thomas's classroom. Having heard about the trade, the beauty was surprised by the progress of that group. Her friends hastened to dispel her assumptions, because only David had achieved such success. The class monitor crossed her fingers and told about the lecture given by the main character, which kindled the desire to study in his classmates. Nancy looked at her friend with her unusual eyes and listened attentively. Ruby admired the boy's character and abilities. The main beauty also acknowledged that the hero has a unique aura that attracts people to him. The next day, David was stacking his books when one of the students called out to him. Claire stood in front of him, asking the guy to evaluate her notes from yesterday's lecture. The basics were correct, but David gave her a couple more useful tips, and the girl listened to him attentively. Alan, sitting nearby, laughed loudly at the fact that people were turning to the main character for advice when he only uttered a few stupid phrases. The student in glasses got angry and suggested that the upstart answer the question asked by the lecturer himself next time. The unpleasant guy began to smile and called David's ideas old-fashioned and useless. Dissatisfied, Claire began to refute the words of her narcissistic classmate. The girl argued her position with the words of the teacher, who called the hero's thinking very valuable for learning. Rachel watched this entire argument, lost in her own thoughts. She immediately remembered how David had confidently and eloquently explained a very difficult topic to the entire class yesterday. The headman looked at him and realized that he had a certain pattern of behavior that he regularly used and improved. Finally, the girl realized why all her friends were drawn to him. He was kind, smart, and handsome. Rachel compared David to the CEO from her novel. Their characters should be almost identical. The secret of the hero's charm will allow the writer to explain how the director makes the heroine of her work, Emily, fall in love with him. Her sister Molly has chained herself to him. She wants to escape, but at the same time, she does not want to lose the pleasure she gets from this torment. Suddenly, the head girl looked up and admitted to herself that she felt admiration for David. Memories of moments spent alone with him appeared before the girl. Rachel sighed sadly, realizing that she would never be able to surpass him. She looked at the main character's desk and decided at all costs to finally make peace with him. Suddenly, the girl's eyes opened wide. Her face expressed bewilderment. There were a bunch of students standing next to the guy, including Tina and Brittany. They asked him various questions about financial success and listened eagerly to every word he said. One of them grabbed his head and smiled nervously, realizing that he had asked a very stupid question. The hero was lost in his thoughts. In his opinion, his classmates' requests to share advice were too closely tied to a certain era. The students discussed his words among themselves, which made the guy very authoritative and powerful. David has already introduced a team of his fellow students who will become successful investors. He was distracted from his thoughts by heated students demanding answers to their questions. Suddenly, Rachel came up to the table. Looking down shyly, she also had a few questions. After some time, the headman sat in her room and cursed the main character again. It turned out that David asked the girl to wait while he solved the problem of other students. Tina and Brittany then began asking their friend about the intricacies of finance. The hero sat in his room with his hand to his forehead. He was surprised that the headman was offended by such a trifle. The red-haired friend thanked the guy and asked him to come to her and explain the topic. At the same time, she put her palms on his shoulders. He was embarrassed. Brittany expressed her dissatisfaction with her about this. Tina stuck her tongue out at her neighbor. Memories of this situation made the protagonist very nervous. He grabbed his chin, noticing the stark difference between Rachel's behavior online and in real life. David soon put those thoughts aside and began typing a message for the headman. The guy asked her about reconciliation with him. The girl was very unhappy, remembering what happened. Rachel complained to an online friend that the hero was constantly surrounded by a bunch of girls his age. The hero called this feeling jealousy. The head woman looked furiously at the screen of her phone. The writer finally found the motivation to write a novel and prove her superiority over David. The guy put the smartphone to his face and smiled. He was succeeding in following his plan. Soon he named his team 2 vegetarians. The writer was not happy with him, but still thanked her friend. A couple of weeks later, the headmistress was overjoyed that she had several orders at once. Rachel grinned, eager to share her quick success with David. The girl's celebration was ruined by the main character, who reported bad news. The guy, looking at his phone, was worried because the upcoming competition would slow down the speed of writing the novel. Despite this, he asked the headman to paint a few passionate scenes that would help attract a small audience, since he did not want to disturb the writer. Rachel breathed a sigh of relief. She thought the book was in serious trouble. The girl also read about the guy's offer to almost double her salary. The inspired headman thanked him for his generosity and promised to do the job to the best of her ability. David got ready to go to bed, happy with another problem successfully solved. Suddenly, he received a message from Rachel. She could not fulfill his request, since this scene takes place in captivity, and she does not understand this at all. The hero called himself and her a duo of lovers. Within moments, the guy had a great idea. The main character immediately remembered the leash given to him by the system. The guy smiled widely, deciding that this would help her solve her problem. The next day, David and the headman crossed paths by chance at the university stadium. The hero asked the girl why she was running here at such an early hour. The boy was very surprised, because in her past life, the head woman started playing sports much later. Rachel watched her classmate closely, not understanding why her run had interested him so much. Suddenly, she turned away and thought about her next plan of action. She couldn't react sharply to the question, because she would seem not mature enough. Finally, the girl plucked up her courage and breathed a sigh of relief. A few seconds later, she turned to the main character and suggested that they go to the canteen together, and he happily agreed. Before going to the cafeteria, they had to complete their run. Suddenly, the phone in Rachel's shorts pocket vibrated and beeped. On her smartphone screen, she found a notification about the delivery of a parcel. A little later, David offered to help the headman carry her, citing the girl's petite figure. The headman looked at him angrily, considering these words a sign of disrespect. The guy looking away replied that he simply considered women weak compared to men. Rachel quickened her pace, not wanting to appear weak. Suddenly, the head man pointed her finger at the hero and ordered him to wait for her here. He had no choice but to agree. Soon the girl finally found a cardboard box sent by a friend from the internet. She smiled sweetly when she noticed David's name on the box, thinking that the guy had given his name as a character from the novel. Suddenly, the main character came up and asked why the headman was smiling while looking at the box. Rachel rudely ordered him not to meddle in her personal affairs. The guy smiled because he knew the truth. He remembered the effort he had put into sending the parcel. Suddenly, the girl walked away. The hero looked after her. On the way, the headman asked him about the possibility of earning real money on the stock market. She was afraid that David was easy prey for big companies. A drop of cold sweat rolled down the protagonist's face. He didn't even think about it. Then the guy asked the girl why she was studying finance if she considered it so dangerous. Suddenly, Rachel turned around and looked at him closely with her violet eyes. The hero told his friend about special rules in economics, and she listened to him with interest. He told her about the law punishing dishonest traders, and the head man was surprised. David smiled sweetly and advised the girl to be careful and cautious when dealing with finances. She looked over her shoulder at him and asked how a new student knew so much. The main character raised his head up and looked at the sky. He was studying trading to make his dream come true. His eyes were filled with determination to finally achieve his goals. David now has a system that will help him live his best life. Rachel cast a thoughtful glance at her comrade. He smiled and explained that every person can fulfill their dream through perseverance and persistence. The headwoman became unlike herself. A spark of inspiration flashed in her eyes. The guy threw up his hands and offered to help her learn finance, but she didn't believe in his good intentions. The hero asked her for a small fee for the lessons, and the irritated Rachel only agreed to treat him to breakfast. At the entrance to the university, they met Tina, who was worried that David and her neighbor were walking together. The dissatisfied headman told her friend about the meeting at the stadium. The main character reminded him about the promised breakfast. The girl ordered him to shut up immediately. Then she hurried to the dining room. The guy asked her to be less irritable. A puzzled Tina watched their strange conversation. The red-haired student turned pale, because her friend had hated David just yesterday. Soon she ran towards the main character who did not notice her. A moment later, Tina bumped into the guy and, hugging him tightly by the arm, asked about the dish he would be eating for breakfast. Suddenly, The main character broke free from his classmate's grip and said that Rachel would be choosing the dish today. She stood there for a long time with her mouth open in amazement, not understanding why the headman was treating David. Meanwhile, the hero and the writer were arguing heatedly, discussing the health benefits of the food the guy was eating. A little later, the three of them were sitting at the same table. The girls ordered a regular breakfast, and David chose noodles. Suddenly, Tina offered her friend to try a meatball from her dish and carefully handed him the meatball. In fact, she was very nervous because she and Brittany would not be able to compete with Rachel for the hero's attention. David politely declined his classmate's offer and began to eat his delicious noodles. Suddenly, Tina waved to the students who had just entered the cafeteria. The head woman felt discomfort and literally started shaking. The students who arrived were none other than Ruby and Nancy. A few minutes later, the university's most beautiful woman was already enjoying her nutritious and healthy vegetable salad. Students from another group were sitting at the next table. The red-haired friend whispered to him about the strange atmosphere that surrounded them. At that very moment, Ruby called out to the protagonist and inquired about Brittany's absence. David, with a smile on his face, explained that she was still sleeping, which was why she couldn't come. Nancy talked about her habit of eating breakfast earlier than the rest of the students. The guy immediately realized that she wanted to eat in peace and not be surrounded by a crowd of admirers. Rachel's face showed displeasure as she remembered David and the beauty's recent dinner. The headman ordered the hero to close his mouth and eat while Nancy watched. The student with beautiful eyes decided that the girl either loved the guy or wanted to get even with her for the past. At this time, David agreed to fulfill Rachel's request, which greatly surprised Tina, who was sitting next to her. She reminded him of her invitation to breakfast, which he declined. The guy replied that he was listening to the one who first invited him and paid for the food. Ruby gave David a thumbs up and praised him for showing his character. The main character grinned and offered her to treat him. The girl with the bob politely refused, citing her small capital. Unexpectedly, Ruby reminded her friend of her offer to treat David. The hero raised his index finger and rejected the idea. Nancy was shy, but promised to take the guy to a restaurant on the embankment the next time they met, but jokingly asked him not to give her a ring. He explained to those present that this establishment is usually used by young couples to declare their love. David suggested going to any other restaurant if this one embarrasses the girl. At that very moment, Tina was overcome with fear. Now her rival was not only Rachel, but also the university's most beautiful girl. She grabbed her chin with her hand and decided to change the subject to take control. The red-haired student immediately noticed her friend's package lying on the table. She almost instantly reached for the box to see the contents. According to Tina, there was something very light inside. Upon hearing that the gift had been sent by Rachel's friend, her friend immediately realized that it was the stranger with whom she corresponded every evening. The head woman wanted to keep this a secret, so she became terribly angry. She instantly snatched the parcel from the hands of Tina, who was sitting next to her. David suggested that the gift might have been sent by a fan, so it shouldn't be opened in public. The angry girl denied his words, saying that she never accepts parcels from fans. Ruby then told the audience about Rachel's popularity in the student council. She also told about the declarations of love addressed to the headman, who was very offended. The writer put the box on the table and declared that inside was only a decoration that a friend had helped her order. She exhaled nervously and suggested that her red-haired neighbor open the package later. Rachel also allowed her to wear the jewelry for a while, which Tina was incredibly happy about. The head woman didn't have anything spicy, so she suggested that her friends return for breakfast. Suddenly, Tina took out her eyebrow razor and began cutting the tape that was stuck to the parcel. From there, the joyful girl took out a beautiful gift box tied with a ribbon. Rachel glanced nervously at Tina, waiting for the moment to open the box. In fact, the headman was very nervous, because absolutely anything could be inside. Suddenly, the red-haired student accidentally dropped the box on the floor, and the girls saw its contents. Rachel's expression was one of bewilderment, and beads of sweat were running down her face. The next moment, Tina picked up the black collar that had been in the package all this time. The bewildered headman looked with fear at the extremely unusual gift. The alarmed red-haired girl immediately gave the collar back to its owner. The students at the next table watched in amazement as two friends tossed an unusual gift back and forth. The university's hottie began to look at the object flying above the table. Nancy had a horrible vision of Rachel and Tina using the collar to fulfill their dirty fantasies. The two friends' quarrel was interrupted by Ruby, who advised them to use the item for walking the dog. The head woman hastened to calm the girl down and admitted that she herself did not know about the contents of the parcel. The girl's eyes were fixed on the floor. She was unbearably ashamed, but she had to get out of this awkward situation. Then Rachel called out to Tina and asked how she felt after such a misunderstanding. You smiled and covered your face with your hand, admitting that she liked men, not women. The headman looked at her in surprise, not understanding what her love preferences had to do with it. Nancy walked past and, clapping Rachel on the shoulder, asked her to start respecting other people's tastes. The beauty smiled broadly, because she had the chance to witness such an absurd and funny scene. The headman, burning with shame, turned her pale face towards her. Nancy and Ruby politely said goodbye to the 3 students before leaving. Suddenly, the main character began to laugh loudly, which seriously angered Rachel. Then he looked down at the floor and said that he was very surprised to learn about the girl's unusual hobby. The headman again called it a simple misunderstanding, and clapping the boy on the back, ordered him to stop laughing. Suddenly, tears appeared in Rachel's eyes, and she was now a laughing stock not only for Nancy, but for David as well. A few seconds later, she lay down on the table and burst into bitter tears. The hero fell silent. Tina ordered her friend to stop crying immediately, because there were a lot of people looking at them. In fact, the red-haired student was glad that the university's hottie had finally left, and the head boy's fetish would drive her away from David. She then turned to the protagonist and asked him to talk to his crying friend. He stood in an imperturbable pose, his face expressing calm and peace. The hero patted Rachel on the head and called everything that happened a trifle. He handed the sobbing girl a napkin and offered to bring her ice cream. Before leaving, he turned to Tina and asked her to keep an eye on the headman. She was perplexed because the guy was too caring towards the girl who didn't like him. The student looked at David buying ice cream, wondering about his possible feelings for his crying friend. Tina guessed that the hero was trying to resist Rachel's domineering nature in order to crush her pride and reveal his true feelings. The girl's face turned red with embarrassment. She didn't believe in love between them. Suddenly, the system informed the main character about a level increase. As a reward, he received a sweet obedience toffee that would make any person fulfill some of his requests. David was very nervous as he thought about his plan for using the unusual artifact. Finally, the guy got the coveted ice cream and headed to his girlfriend's table. He unexpectedly shocked Tina by asking her to return to the classroom first. The girl agreed, promising to save places for him and the headman. Rachel, still lying on the table, ordered the hero to go away through tears. He advised her to calm down and handed her some delicious ice cream. The girl started screaming and demanded that this disgusting, in her opinion, treat be immediately removed from her. David insisted that she eat dessert since he had already paid for it. Suddenly, the guy offered his advice on how to get out of this situation in exchange for some ice cream. Rachel finally stopped sobbing and raised her head. She wiped her tears with her sleeve and, taking the dessert, asked the hero to swear to help her. The girl began to open the ice cream package. Her tear-stained face seemed very sweet and innocent to David. The head woman tried to calm down and brought her tongue to the vanilla dessert. For several minutes, the hero watched her, as if enchanted. After that, Rachel finished her ice cream and ordered the guy to immediately share his solution to the current situation. The girl's face expressed true fear and shame. She could only hope for David. A few seconds later, the main character suggested that his friend publicly confess her unusual hobby. Suddenly, the head woman grabbed the guy by the hand and sank her teeth into it, like a real vampire. When she let go of him, the hero looked in fear at the skin that was red from the bite. An angry Rachel called David's plan idiotic and pointless. Then he suggested that she act as if nothing had happened. The girl looked at the main character in surprise. Now she would have to behave like an arrogant queen. David laughed, because in his opinion, the headmistress had always been like that. She screamed loudly. She didn't believe in the guy's good motives. The hero hastened to dispel her thoughts and said that the girl's arrogant behavior would not give him any benefit at all. An agitated Rachel tried again to explain the situation to him, which only made her situation worse. The head woman turned away from David abruptly and folded her arms, not wanting to explain herself to him. The next moment, the protagonist put his hand on her head and advised her to do and say what she thought was right, to just be herself. These words made Rachel cry. She looked at the guy with eyes from which tears were flowing. Then a classmate offered the girl a candy and handed over his toffee. The enraged headman almost instantly snatched it from his hands and threw it into her mouth. Their eyes met. David decided to try out the magic candy. He moved closer to Rachel's ear and again offered to help resolve the situation. She looked at him in amazement, not understanding why he was returning to a not very pleasant conversation. Despite this, dialogue with him will help her better reveal the image of the director from her novel. The headmistress stared at the floor, now appearing in the role of Molly from her work. Suddenly, the girl realized the absurdity of the situation and was horrified. Suddenly, she pushed David away from her. He was perplexed. Rachel didn't want to be fooled by the guy, so she screamed loudly and decided to go back to class. The protagonist tried to talk to her, but the girl slipped past him. He smiled as he watched her go. She didn't fall for his trick. Soon, David stood up from his chair and headed towards the exit of the dining room. At the same time, the guy thought about Rachel's domineering and unpleasant character. When the hero went outside, he warmed up a little. A difficult day lay ahead. A few hours later, he was sitting at the table in his room, thinking about the financial market. The website of a financial exchange was open on the laptop screen, and the guy decided to focus on his financial model. The main character was distracted by a sudden loud knock on the front door. Mike and Ron came inside, asking about his absence from classes today. He told his friends about the permission that Thomas himself gave him to skip classes. Suddenly, the guy in glasses threw up his hands and declared that the group leader was a lesbian. The protagonist sighed and, smiling, called it just ordinary stupid rumors. Mike told her that Rachel had approached Nancy during recess and admitted it herself, and David froze at first. Then his eyes became frightened, his mouth opened, and sweat ran down his cheeks. The bewildered hero asked his friends to tell him in detail what had happened. Mike began his story in an excited manner, waving his arms. According to him, Rachel entered the classroom as soon as the bell rang for the end of the lesson. The head woman was smiling, but despite this, she exuded an aura of seriousness. The girl then headed towards Nancy's table, where she was perplexed. The frightened university beauty looked at her cautiously and asked what she wanted. Suddenly, Rachel grabbed the unfortunate student's hand. Then she deftly pulled Nancy towards her, and she screamed loudly. The headman approached the girl's face, but almost no one present made out their words. Soon, Rachel moved away from the beauty and laughed, reminding her of the gift that was intended especially for her. Then, according to Mike, the head girl left, leaving behind a stunned Nancy. Suddenly, Ron asked the main character about the gift that the girl mentioned. An agitated David replied that he knew absolutely nothing about him. The guy's eyes filled with fear, because he was the one who caused this scene. Rachel was disgraced, so she decided to bring even more shame to her enemy. Mike approached the hero, and putting his hand on his shoulder, asked him to help him sort out this unpleasant situation. David expressed dissatisfaction with his friend's request. He could not cope with his curiosity. The next second, the main character got up from his chair and decided to go have a bite to eat, inviting his neighbors to join him. The guys lied that they had already eaten and were now planning to get some sleep. Before leaving, David announced his intention to come to class in the afternoon. An alarmed Ron and Mike waved wildly after him. After lunch, the guy came into the classroom, and an excited Brittany immediately ran up to him. The protagonist immediately realized that his friend would tell him about what happened between Rachel and Nancy, but she looked suspiciously happy. The green-haired student called her neighbor incredibly brave because she expressed her thoughts directly to her enemy's face. David didn't listen to her very carefully. Suddenly, Brittany imagined a strange scene in which the headman and the beauty exchange glances and admire each other. Suddenly, the main character noticed that the green-haired girl became closer and friendlier to Rachel. At that very moment, she grabbed his hand and brought it to her chin, imitating the scene she had just imagined. At this moment, Brittany looked shyly and embarrassedly at the guy. David suddenly turned pale and became very nervous. The student looked at his hand in fascination, asking the hero not to interfere in the relationship between her and the class monitor. The guy's face showed genuine disgust when he heard about Rachel using a leash on Brittany. The stunned classmates watched the strange scene unfolding between them. Noticing this, the green-haired girl quickly let go of David's hand. The student called the guy her best friend, looking at him strangely. The frightened protagonist admitted with horror that Rachel had fallen in love. Brittany immediately invited him to have lunch together and dragged him along with her. Unfortunately, the headmistress became a lovesick fool, which made David start to get nervous. The main character stood up from his chair and froze in place, realizing the full horror of the situation. He hadn't seen Tina for a long time, so he decided that she and Rachel had had a fight, and Brittany also started acting strange. A picture appeared before him of the class monitor and the red-haired student going their separate ways. He was distracted from these bad thoughts by a green-haired friend standing next to him. Suddenly, David finally remembered about his second account, which would allow him to contact Rachel. A few minutes later, he was already sitting at the computer located in the library. The guy carefully read the girl's messages in which he complained about the troubles that happened today. The main character felt incredibly ashamed because it was he who became the cause of her troubles. Suddenly, the head girl told her that Tina almost embarrassed her in front of the guy of her dreams. David was very surprised. Soon, the hero realized that he was her dream guy, and he was torn apart by a feeling of shame. Apparently, it all happened under the influence of the magic candy. David decided to be more frank with her on the internet. Judging by the time the messages were sent, Rachel didn't wait for a response from him, so she confessed everything to Nancy. A little later, the main character picked up his phone, wanting to check the news feed. The guy turned off the computer. Before that, he found out that the main beauty of the university only communicates with girls and perhaps likes leashes. The image of Nancy with a collar around her neck immediately appeared before my eyes. The hero's face turned a little red. It would have been a truly wonderful sight. A few minutes later, David entered his classroom. Tina immediately jumped up from her seat and invited me to sit next to her. Soon the protagonist walked past a tense and dissatisfied Rachel. Suddenly the headman called out to him and offered to talk a little. He was very scared and turned pale. Beads of sweat began to run down his face. A moment later, David approached the disgruntled girl's table. Rachel remained silent but cast a dark and even frightening glance at him. When the guy finally sat down next to her, she told him about her recent meeting with Director Robert. The girl reported that the man expressed a desire to deprive her of her position as headman. The main character hastened to calm the girl down and said that the director could not so easily deprive her of the position of head girl. Rachel agreed, breathed a sigh of relief, and began to think about how to deal with this. The guy advised his friend to buy 2 packs of mint cigarettes and, wrapping them in a black bag, put them under Robert's table and then chat with him a little. The head girl opened her mouth and froze, not expecting such strange advice from her classmate. David threw up his hands and suggested that the girl solve this problem herself if she was not satisfied with his idea. Rachel looked up thoughtfully and agreed to do it, but only tomorrow morning. The main character was worried about his girlfriend's excessive naivety. Apparently, the magic candy was still working. He was more attracted to her rebellious nature. The head woman, angered by these words, advised the boy to watch his language. David was unhappy with this attitude towards himself, but despite this, he suggested forgetting about this misunderstanding. Soon he opened one of the textbooks, asking the student not to contact him in case of further trouble. Rachel asked with interest what could be worse than the current situation. Suddenly, she reminded the main character of her not-so-great relationship with Nancy. The guy wished her luck in resolving the conflict, even though he didn't know what was going on between them. He also told the girl about the importance of decisions that people make following their hearts. Suddenly, the system informed the hero that he had mastered the skill of incitement, which did not particularly please him. David looked at the projector set up in the classroom. Now he had to decide what to spend the money the novel would bring in on. A couple of weeks later, David received a notification from the system about an improvement in his instigation skill, even though he had done nothing at all. Rachel sent the hero a message in which she congratulated him and herself on the fact that their novel made it to the best list and called herself his fan. Then David wrote to her asking if she was a fan of the guy of his dreams. The girl replied with a smile on her face that these were 2 completely different things. He also asked the writer about her recent situation. The headman was a little displeased with his untimely reaction. The protagonist pointed out that the girl was constantly mentioning the guy of her dreams, so he suggested that she try to get him. David smiled wickedly. The system had once again increased his incitement skill. Rachel froze in amazement when she read the message. Her eyes were filled with confusion, and a drop of sweat ran down her cheek. The girl suddenly realized that she had never tried to get closer to her classmate. She remembered that the guy was very busy right now, and besides, he would hardly want to date a lesbian, which is what the students thought she was. The main character suggested that Rachel not waste her chance and invite him on a date. The headman decided to follow his advice and sent a message promising to meet him at the weekend. A few days later, David was called by a familiar voice while jogging in the stadium in the morning. It was Rachel, in an unusual green outfit. The guy decided that she was going on a date with Nancy. The girl explained that she had already gone home, and a little shyly, suggested that the hero go with her to the recently opened fear room near the university. David was just free, but he pretended not to understand why she invited him. The head woman blushed and, looking away, asked again about his readiness to take a walk with her. The main character agreed, but only if the girl paid for him. Rachel reluctantly agreed to pay for the guy's ticket and lunch. After this, David asked his friend to wait a little while he changed his clothes. She advised him to hurry because the seats were already booked. A few minutes later, the couple was walking down the street, and the headman clearly felt uncomfortable. Then the hero broke the awkward silence and asked why she invited him so suddenly. Rachel tensed up, not knowing how to answer him. David called himself ham in his correspondence with the girl. The headman did not want to admit everything, because she did not even like the guy. Suddenly, the main character asked his friend if she had a problem in her relationship with Nancy. He stuck out his fist and promised to help the girl solve absolutely any problem she might have. Suddenly, Rachel flared up and, very angry, refuted David's theories. He turned pale and, covering himself with his hands, advised his friend to resort to less violence. Suddenly, the main character pointed his finger at the building behind the headman. At the entrance stood a man dressed as a maniac from a popular horror film, inviting passers-by to visit the new haunted house. David invited his friend to go inside, and the animator happily agreed to take them inside. Within a few minutes, Rachel was wandering in complete darkness, the path illuminated only by the dim light of a lantern. Suddenly, a hand that emerged from the frightening darkness touched the headman's shoulder. The girl was very scared and screamed in fear. Tears appeared in her eyes. It was David. The student rudely scolded him for such behavior. The main character threw up his hands and tried to explain his actions by saying that he was trying to lighten the eerie atmosphere. Rachel breathed a sigh of relief and declared that the question of economics was as scary to her as the terrible monster. The head girl shone a flashlight on her face and complained that she was finding her classes difficult, especially after Thomas started speeding up their learning. David encouraged his friend, saying that studying finance takes real talent. The hero told her about an upcoming competition on the topic of stocks and suggested that she compensate for her lack of talent with hard work. Rachel, worried, said she hadn't heard from him, and her flashlight started to blink. Within moments, it went out completely, plunging the room into pitch darkness. Suddenly, the headman encountered a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. The lantern finally started working again, and the girl turned towards the ominous figure. A second later, she frightenedly directed a beam of light straight at the stranger. The beam of the flashlight fell directly on the face of a terrible man in a mask made of human skin, armed with a chainsaw. After some time, the couple was already having dinner. David asked why his friend took him to the fear room if she was so afraid of it. Rachel, with tears in her eyes, slammed her glass of soda on the table and explained that the actor had appeared too unexpectedly. After that, she leaned on her hand and reminded him of the financial competition that the guy had recently mentioned. David stared at the table and explained that the teacher and other students had been talking about him for a long time. He looked at his friend and asked how the headman could not know about this. The girl looked at him and became nervous, feeling that his attitude towards her had become cold. David, sipping juice, reminded Rachel of her desire to surpass him, so she should pay more attention to university news. He suddenly expressed the opinion that the headman was trying to use him as a shield to hide from what had happened between her and Nancy. After this, the main character got up from his chair and promised his worried friend not to interfere in her personal affairs. David headed for the exit, telling the waitress on the way that he was finished eating. The hero waved goodbye to Rachel and wished her bon appetit. The girl leaned on the table and vainly asked him to stay, but the guy didn't even stop. A tear rolled down the upset headman's face. She had never even thought of using David as a shield. Soon the girl was left completely alone, staring at the floor. She realized that anyone who approached her or Nancy would immediately become the object of persecution. The girl put her fist forward and resigned herself to the fact that David did not want to be seen near her. Meanwhile, Nancy was engrossed in reading a magazine and was distracted by a message that came on her phone. Rachel invited her to have lunch together. The most beautiful girl of the university was not too pleased with her offer. She grinned slyly. It seemed the girl had come up with a plan. At this time, the main character was heading to the hostel but suddenly stopped. He took his phone out of his pocket and found a message from Nancy asking to be added as a friend. David glanced at his smartphone screen and immediately knew it had to do with Rachel. The university's top beauty explained that she got the guy's number from her friend Ruby. Suddenly, the girl suggested that the hero have a bite to eat together at a Japanese restaurant. He agreed to meet in half an hour. Nancy understood that Rachel was in love with him. She smiled. Her plan was to pull the main character over to her. This would solve the problem with the opponent. Suddenly, Nancy received a message in which he said that he would be busy all day and therefore would not be able to go to the restaurant with her. The girl's unusual eyes became empty. The hero could not refuse her so abruptly. She suggested that David meet another time. Nancy was very angry when she realized that he had recently been spending time with Rachel. The girl thought about it, in her opinion. The headman was also trying to pull the guy over to her side. Suddenly, Nancy received a message from Rachel asking her to go to the panic room together. The university's most beautiful girl grinned slyly and decided to take advantage of this opportunity. At that very moment, a chill ran through David's body, and he pulled his hands close to him. A little later, he contacted the writer. He was worried that recent events could delay the release of the novel. Soon, the girl invited him to join her team group. She also suggested that their work would bring them several $100,000, and David was inspired. According to Rachel, selling the rights to the novel will bring much less money, and the protagonist thought about her words. Costume dramas were in fashion at the time, and the guy's stock trading skill was only developed to level 3, so it was too dangerous to take risks. Instead, David set about improving his writing skills, which were much needed now. The main character recognized the girl's outstanding talent for writing interesting and captivating texts. Their romance was too ordinary and unremarkable, but Rachel's writing style allowed it to gain a lot of fans. Suddenly, his vibrating phone distracted him from these thoughts. The boy received a sticker from the school's most beautiful girl with a little dinosaur calling on the phone. Soon Nancy was sitting in a restaurant and making a rather expensive order. The girl put on her best dress. She turned to the main character, sitting opposite, and asked if he would like some alcohol. He suggested to his friend to wait with this for now, since their order was already very large. Nancy followed his request and decided to make the most of her new free time. Finally, the girl said that she had been trying to invite the guy to spend time together for almost a month. David scratched his head nervously. He had been too busy all this time. She asked whether the hero's diligent studies were connected with the upcoming financial competition. He answered negatively. After that, Nancy's insanely beautiful eyes stared straight at the guy. Soon the waiter brought 2 small cups. David thanked him. The main character and his girlfriend began to discuss the interior decoration of the restaurant. Finally, he picked up his chopsticks and thanked the girl for her kindness and generosity. Suddenly, she called his manner of speech interesting. The guy became nervous. Sweat started running down his face. The protagonist grabbed his chin and laughed it off, not really even imagining Nancy's true motives. At this time, the girl was ruffling her hair and looking at David with beautiful iridescent eyes. A few minutes later, the waiter brought a plate with several crabs. The guy was shocked by their appetizing appearance. The main character reached for the cutlery in order to quickly try the unusual delicacy. Suddenly, the girl put her hand forward and ordered the guy to stop immediately. Nancy picked up her phone and started taking pictures of the food. Suddenly, David froze, realizing that he had never seen food photos on her social media. The university's most beautiful girl smiled sweetly, while the main character was nervous and worried. After this, the girl suggested starting to eat, but before that, the guy had to like her post. He hastened to fulfill her request and reached into his pocket for his phone. When David logged into the social network, he saw a photo that depicted not only food but also himself. The protagonist realized that Nancy did this in order to deal with Rachel. He turned pale and began to sweat. Suddenly, the girl took a meatball out of her plate and offered the guy to try it. While he was realizing the full horror of the situation, a male voice called out to Nancy. David jumped up from his chair and saw the girl's father, Anthony. Behind him stood his friend Ethan and a man with a small scar on his face named Bruce. They wanted to have a few drinks and relax. His daughter smiled sweetly and promised her father to keep it a secret. The man happily thanked his beloved little girl. After this, he turned his attention to the main character and asked Nancy to introduce him. The guy finally calmed down, said his name, and extended his hand to the girl's father. Soon, Anthony and David shook hands, showing mutual respect. Nancy had never eaten with guys before, and the man was glad that his daughter had started making new friends. He hoped that their characters would get along and acknowledged the hero's rather strong body. His daughter watched this nervously. David felt very uncomfortable with the rather strange dialogue with Anthony. Suddenly, his scarred man said something about the sharpness and sparkle in the boy's eyes, which distinguished him from his pathetic and soft peers. He laughed and said that training is very important for young people, and Ethan felt a little uncomfortable. Soon, Bruce and Ethan started a small discussion. Anthony asked them to stop. Nancy placed her hands on her father's shoulders and invited the men to go to her room. Her father agreed, and before leaving, he promised to pay for any order, which greatly embarrassed David. Anthony stuck out his hand with his thumb up and insisted on his offer. The main character waved goodbye to him. Soon, all 3 men began to climb the stairs and discuss the guy's politeness. A few seconds later, the main character invited his friend to continue their meal. Nancy sat down on a chair, her face clearly expressing displeasure at what had happened. She looked away and wondered why he was so enthusiastic about David. The protagonist looked at the stairs and asked Nancy about her father and uncle. Suddenly, the girl seemed to explode when she heard him call Anthony Dad. She suggested that the guy come up to their room and personally call him that. In exchange, the beauty would tell him everything he asked about. The hero looked at her, smiled, and decided to take a risk. Nancy immediately blushed and accused David of lacking professional ethics. The guy hastened to calm her down and reminded her that she was not treating him now, so the rules of ethics would be superfluous. The dissatisfied girl reluctantly admitted that he was right. She folded her arms and, looking away from David, explained that her uncle was the director of the humanities department at their university. Anthony, she said, is a member of the board of directors at the university. Now the main character understood why the girl decided to study the humanities. After that, he looked at the table and asked why she didn't go to a more prestigious university, having such rich relatives. The guy also pointed out that it would be quite difficult to complete his studies with the help of exams, but the girl remained silent. Nancy soon looked away and declared that she was completely indifferent to where she studied. She considered herself not smart enough to graduate from a prestigious university, and her mother didn't want to let her daughter down too far. David felt a little awkward from this answer. The next moment, the main character picked up the crab and began to cut it up. He carefully examined the poor sea creature that had fallen into the fisherman's nets and ended up on this table. Nancy managed to get a small piece of meat out of the crab and was already looking at it, anticipating the exquisite and pleasant taste. David put the meat in his mouth, thinking about his friend's prospects after the wedding, for which people like her were prepared. Suddenly, the guy distracted the girl from her meal with a question about whether she wanted to go abroad. She, pressing her hands to her chest, bitterly explained that her future had long been determined by the will of her parents. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a man dressed in green clothes. A few moments later, the main character froze, seeing a rather strange picture in front of him. Rachel, who arrived at the restaurant, began to hug Nancy, who was confused. The head girl used her hand to turn the face of the university's most beautiful girl towards herself. David froze in amazement and felt very uncomfortable at the sight of this picture. The uninvited guest approached the displeased Nancy's face. The guy grabbed his head and understood why the girl's father was so delighted to see his daughter in the company of a young man. Suddenly, a woman approached the main character and asked him to go to Mr. Anthony, who wanted to talk to him. Rachel finally calmed down. Both girls wondered why the man needed David. As he approached the room he needed, he heard Ethan and his Anthony talking. They were discussing a recent incident that happened at the university. Nancy's father was very worried because he was afraid that his daughter might be in love with Rachel. Right at the door, David heard him say that their family's business should pass into the hands of the girl's future husband. The main character stood rooted to the spot, realizing the absurdity of the situation. He stood at the door for a while, thinking it would be stupid not to take advantage of such a chance, and the restaurant worker finally asked him to come inside. The guy came to his senses and decided to immediately open the door behind which a happy and prosperous future could await him. There he was greeted very friendly by Nancy's slightly plump father. Suddenly, everyone present noticed a bottle of alcohol and a glass in the young man's hands. He explained to Mr. Anthony that he felt it would be disrespectful to come empty-handed. The young man thanked the men for their hospitality and proposed raising a toast in their honor. Within a few seconds, David poured the contents of the bottle into a glass. The guy glanced at the men and prepared to make a toast. A few moments later, his glass touched Anthony's. Immediately after this, the main character and the man began to exchange thanks. Nancy's father raised the glass to his lips and began to drink the wine, noticing the boy's scrupulous adherence to etiquette. Meanwhile, the hero had already managed to treat Ethan to a drink. Anthony then approached David with a question regarding his unusual accent. The young man turned to him and explained that he had come here from the city of dreams. According to him, he is not really familiar with the city, which is why he lives in a dormitory. Fortunately, the low workload of classes allows him to find free time for rest. The plump man put his hand to his chin and called the boy's birthplace a pretty good place. Anthony asked David to accompany his daughter more often on shopping trips and the like. He will also take on all monetary expenses. The main character became uncomfortable with excessive generosity. The young man tried to politely refuse, saying that he spent almost all his free time on self-study. He also mentioned Nancy's passion for spending time with girls. According to him, the girl is sitting at a table with her friend right now. Her father's face has turned pale. The man quickly wiped the sweat from his face with a towel and inquired about the identity of his daughter's friend who had come. The main character said that the guest was the head of his class named Rachel. Anthony thanked the guy for the information and allowed him to return to Nancy. David politely said goodbye to the good-natured man and headed towards the exit of the room. He considered the young man a wonderful person looking after him. When the hero walked out and closed the door behind him, the man's face instantly changed. He grabbed his head with both hands and began to panic. Anthony quickly stood up from his chair and started screaming, not believing what had happened. The plump man headed towards the exit to see his daughter and her friend in person, but his brother tried to stop him. Concerned, Ethan and Bruce advised him to wait a little before going down to the children. Hearing this, Anthony began to boil with anger. At this time, Nancy and Rachel looked at the main character who had just returned. The guy hurried to explain to the girl that the father asked him to take care of his daughter. Suddenly, the head girl interrupted him and declared that she could handle the task perfectly well herself. The university's most beautiful girl was perplexed. Then David asked Rachel why she came here in the first place. According to the headman, who put her arm around Nancy's neck, she wanted to try the delicious crabs. A few moments later, she called the waiter over and asked him to bring 2 more servings of the seafood delicacy. The guy sat down at the table and acknowledged Nancy's bad luck, who had the chance to meet not only her own father here, but also a girl she didn't like. Suddenly, the university's most beautiful woman removed Rachel's hand from her and declared that she would have to pay for herself. The headman sighed with displeasure and reluctantly agreed to fulfill her demand. She then pointed her finger at the hero and called him a two-faced guy who was trying to seduce every hottie in the university. Unexpectedly, Nancy refuted her words, explaining that she personally invited the guy to the restaurant. Word for word, the girls began a verbal altercation in which Rachel was clearly not on David's side. He got a little scared and asked the students not to involve him in their squabbles. Immediately after this, the young man took a glass of wine in his hand and wished his girlfriends many years of happiness. After drinking the contents, he smiled and turned away, clutching his head. At that very moment, the young man noticed Mr. Anthony standing on the stairs behind Rachel. Soon he heard the headman's words that she was going to go on a date with the university's most beautiful girl. The man was stunned. David noticed this, so he tried to silence Rachel. Suddenly, the plump man grabbed the railing of the stairs. The protagonist's eyes filled with fear, and a shudder ran through his body. The young man immediately jumped up in his chair. Mr. Anthony's blood pressure apparently rose. Nancy suggested that her comrades finally eat in peace, and the hero asked her to choose her every word carefully. After that, he pointed his fingers towards the girl's father standing on the stairs. She didn't get his hint and decided that the guy was trying to make fun of her along with Rachel. Suddenly, her gaze became truly frightening. She promised to take revenge on the guy if they were not now in an expensive restaurant. Anthony, who was standing nearby, overheard the conversation between his daughter and the young man. Tears of happiness appeared on the man's face. He decided that Nancy was interested in the main character, but his face immediately changed when he heard his daughter's words about the hero's plan to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Rachel asked the girl to stop. In fact, the headman had feelings for David. She glared at the protagonist, not intending to let him get any attention from Nancy. Suddenly, the headman began to pull his hand towards the neck of the university's most beautiful girl. Rachel then suggested that the dissatisfied girl stop thinking about men and focus only on her. Mr. Anthony shuddered at these words. His worst fears were beginning to be confirmed. The man lowered his head. In his opinion, Nancy was a lesbian, and a worried Bruce appeared behind him. Realizing this terrible truth, the girl's father stopped standing on his feet and began to fall. But a man with a scar on his face managed to grab him. Streams of bitter tears flowed down Anthony's cheeks. It was a huge tragedy not only for him, but for the whole family. Suddenly, the man finally came to his senses, turning his attention to David, who was sitting next to the girls. Soon Anthony headed towards the guy. He was his last hope to save his daughter. Meanwhile, Rachel and Nancy were talking about the indecencies that the beauty allowed herself to do with Brittany. Then the girl with unusual eyes pointed at the hero, saying that her golden-haired friend was so naive and led that she would marry him at the first request. The headman's mouth opened in amazement, not believing such nonsense at all. Suddenly, Nancy suggested that David start dating Brittany to see Rachel's reaction. He was very uncomfortable. Anthony, who was nearby, mistakenly assumed that his daughter was using the young man as cover to then leave with her girlfriend. The man clenched his fist, not wanting to lose his beloved daughter. Then he approached the table. Nancy once again suggested that her friends finally start eating. Anthony asked an unobtrusive question about the taste of the dishes served. The girl was very surprised by his appearance. The plump man explained that he decided to go downstairs in order to meet his daughter's friend in person. Immediately after that, he greeted Rachel, who also greeted him in return. Anthony politely asked the girl about her parents and their well-being. Soon the main character had to observe a rather unpleasant picture. The headman had to answer strange questions that made her feel uncomfortable. David leaned on his arm and began to languish in anticipation of the end of this scene. Suddenly, Anthony turned to the young man and explained that his daughter had always been a little withdrawn, which was why she had so few true friends. After these words, the man put his hand on his shoulder and said that he liked him and Rachel. In addition, he suggested that they drop in to visit Nancy, and the young man had no choice but to agree. Then the school's most beautiful girl immediately sensed something was wrong, because her father was always strict with boys. She couldn't understand what was special about this guy. David noticed her looking at him. The main character smiled sweetly at the girl. The headman noted a strange friendliness that was not characteristic of Mr. Anthony. Nancy wondered why the young man began to smile. The girl with beautiful eyes glared at him angrily. Her eyes became attractive and frightening at the same time. She decided at all costs to find out the true reason for her father's sympathy for David. An hour later, the exhausted protagonist finally returned to his dorm. He soon noticed Mike and Ron inside the room, their faces rather grim. The boys couldn't decide for a few seconds which of them would tell David the news. The puzzled young man asked his comrades what was going on here. The big guy was sweating a little. They waited a long time for the hero to tell them everything. Finally, Ron began his story. A student named Richard asked about the main character. David grabbed his chin, trying to remember this guy. This student is the top student on the international exchange student list. On top of everything else, he was Nancy's biggest fan, which greatly interested the young man. Immediately after this, the protagonist became immersed in thoughts about the true reason for Richard's search for him. David thanked the neighbors for the news. The guys smiled nervously at him. Mike looked at the hero and suggested that it had something to do with Nancy. He spread his hands and agreed with his comrade. Suddenly, Ron decided that the hero would decide to get rid of Richard, so he fearfully told about his important connections and passion for playing poker. The big guy was very scared for the student. He remembered the situation when David took a hammer out of his backpack. Suddenly, he had a vision of a young man sitting surrounded by garbage bags containing the bodies of his acquaintances. Ron was shaking, standing in place. The main character did not understand what was going on. Soon Mike patted his friend on the back and tried to calm him down. The big guy then told David that they needed to step outside for a bit. The young man suggested that the guys spend the night in the room more often, because his hammer is absolutely safe for his friends. Hearing this, Ron and Mike froze and turned pale. A few moments later, the frightened couple headed for the door. The hero waved after them. His comrades were more scared than he thought. After this, David sat down at his desk, deciding not to cross paths with Richard for now. He folded his arms and smiled contentedly as he sent Rachel a portion of the proceeds from the novel's contract. The young man already imagined how in the future he would become a big shot in a formal suit. The hero raised his fist, finding this prospect simply wonderful. A little later, the young man continued his correspondence with the writer, who thanked him for the opportunity to get rich. The girl finally realized her opportunity to earn a lot of money. David sighed happily. Soon, she sent him a message complaining about the lack of money because her friend had recently spent a large sum on a regular lunch. Rachel was in the bathroom telling Ham what happened in the restaurant. The main character quietly laughed, amused by his friend's reaction to Nancy's wealth. The disgruntled head girl wrote a message suggesting that if she earned a lot, she would be able to compete with the girl for David's heart. Rachel worked for a whole year, but still earned much less than Nancy. She was upset. Then the main character, with a smile on his face, suggested to the headman that he surpass the girl in another matter, for example, in beauty. The writer reread his message several times and thought about it. The next day, almost all the students looked at Rachel as she walked past. A few minutes later, she entered the classroom, capturing the attention of her classmates. Alan and his comrades stared at the girl, frozen in amazement. Today, the head woman put on some beautiful makeup and put on her best clothes. Not only guys, but other girls too were looking at her. Next, Rachel turned her attention to David, who decided to attend Thomas's lecture. The main character slowly turned his head towards her, expecting to see a beauty in front of him. A few seconds later, the headman sat down next to the young man. She turned her beautiful face to him and, smiling, wished him good morning. Suddenly, the guy turned away from her and sighed. David pointed out his friend's high spirits and unusual outfit, and she became nervous. The main character then turned his attention to the girl's tights, asking if she had a good time with Nancy. After that, he glanced at the headman's entire appearance and complimented him on his clothes. She interrupted him and rudely stated that she had not dressed up like that for him. The disgruntled girl looked down, surprised by the guy's lack of reaction to her makeup. A few seconds later, a teacher appeared in the classroom, preparing an important announcement. Soon, he spoke about the upcoming financial competition. The lecturer wrote on the board about 3 rounds. In the first, the students use a virtual account. In the second, they will have to work with $40,000. In the final, they will receive about $150,000. Many students were surprised by such a large amount of money. Only the main character sat in complete calm. He made a thoughtful face and remembered that the profits received in the final would go entirely to the participants. Thomas also said that 10 finalists will go to the award ceremony in the Capitol. Rachel's mouth dropped open in amazement. This competition seemed quite intriguing to her. The man in glasses told those who wanted to participate to come to him for registration, and the best students would be exempt from the final exam. A few moments later, the class monitor stood up from her chair, showing the teacher her unusual outfit. David was surprised by his friend's desire to participate in this competition. She called it a great opportunity to earn a lot of money. The main character grimaced, dissatisfied with his friend's greed. Suddenly, Tina approached them and suggested that the guy register together. He looked at Rachel and remembered his past life, in which she had become a real disgrace to trading. The young man turned away, feeling a little sorry for his poor friend. The headman did not stop and did not pay attention to failures, thereby proving her fortitude and steadfastness. When the bell rang, Alan began to boast to his neighbor that he would easily surpass all the participants in the competition. Suddenly, Tina and Brittany flew past him like the wind. The narcissistic guy looked with displeasure at the girls hurrying to David. They hugged the young man and began to invite him to demonstrate his skills at the competition. This sight made Alan very angry. He clenched his fist tightly. The main character noticed this and had a bad feeling. David glanced at the guy and remembered that the relationship between him and Brittany in his past life began at this very competition. The hero also paid attention to Sam and Claire, who had already entered the top 3 traders in the class. He decided that this was the reason why Alan began to attract girls to him. His thoughts were interrupted by the class monitor, who suggested comparing the results at the end of the competition. Her arrogant nature made the guy feel uncomfortable. Rachel looked at him with displeasure. In fact, she wanted to distract her neighbors from him. Suddenly, the guy offered his girlfriend a bet, which made her nervous. David, holding a notebook in his hand, bet that he could earn more income than the girl. She didn't want to compete with him because even the teacher praised him. Other students overheard their conversation and advised giving Rachel a head start to even the odds. Alan laughed nastily and said that he wouldn't compete with David if he were in the prefect's place. Suddenly, she slammed her palm on the table and agreed to a 20% handicap, and everyone present turned to face her. In fact, the girl was very worried because refusing the bet would undermine her authority. The main character agreed to give in to his friend a little, not at all doubting his victory. Tina squealed with joy, admiring the young man's courage. Rachel folded her arms and finally called for the bets to be called. David smiled and, raising his finger, promised to fulfill any request she made if he lost. But if he won, the girl was obliged to forgive him once. The class leader was surprised by such a strange request. Rachel asked what she would have to forgive the main character for. The young man jokingly replied that he was afraid of being caught by her on a date with a beauty. Immediately, a bunch of students, including Alan, began to discuss what they had heard. The girl grabbed her chest and, looking away, replied that the guy's personal life should not concern her. Then David suggested that Rachel come up with his own punishment. Suddenly, the head girl loudly declared that if the hero lost, he would be prohibited from having any love relationships until he graduated from university. He scratched his head and agreed, due to the lack of alternative. Tina grabbed her head, considering her friend's punishment too cruel. One of the students sarcastically noted that this would help him try to win the hearts of the beauties who were obsessed with David. Rachel's heart was pounding madly. She thought her idea was great. Despite the severity of this punishment, the guy asked the girl not to go back on her words. Then the main character extended his hand to her with his little finger extended in order to exchange vows. The headman looked at him in bewilderment, not believing what was happening. After a few seconds, their fingers crossed. Most of the students began to cheer David on, not doubting his victory. Suddenly, the hero and Rachel were interrupted by one of the students, who asked for advice on trend investing. It was quiet. Sam and Claire appeared next to him, asking for the same thing. The main character decided to help his classmates. Alan tried to eavesdrop on their conversation. The young man walked up to his desk and described the industry as very complex. The guy picked up his phone, while simultaneously offering his comrades to point out their mistakes during the market review. Sam happily thanked the young man for his kindness. The girl with glasses asked permission to reserve a seat at the guy's lecture. Then David suggested that the guys create a joint group for such discussions. Sam asked to leave it for him. Claire didn't even add the main character as a friend. Suddenly, Tina came up to them and complained to the guy about her hunger. Immediately after this, the girl with glasses said goodbye to David. Soon, he and his red-haired friend were walking down the hallway, heading to the dining room. Tina invited the young man to go for a walk after lunch, but he refused. The student clutched her chest and said that she would always wait for him. The main character froze in amazement, his face expressing bewilderment. Suddenly, Tina approached the young man and took his hand. The sympathy she felt for him could be seen on the girl's face. A moment later, the main character removed his girlfriend's hand and walked away. The young man stopped and, turning to Tina, said that he believed only in time. The student didn't understand anything, so her face began to express confusion. She looked after the guy and decided that he was so cold because his heart was broken. A few seconds later, the girl ran up to him again and hugged him by the hand. The protagonist tried to break free from her tight grip. At the same moment, the system informed David about the increase in the level of one of his skills. After some time, he, introducing himself as Ham, made a publication in which he called himself a 35-year-old man and lied about his relationship with a student, Rachel. The headman who read this was beside herself. She was filled with bewilderment and anger. The frightened hero explained that this story would draw attention to their affair. The girl immediately calmed down and apologized for her excessive irascibility. It was mid-November, and the protagonist and several other students were in the classroom. The teacher sighed and closed his journal. The man stood up from his chair and asked those present to pass on his request to the other students to bring their laptops to the next class. David was a little disappointed when he heard the tiredness in Thomas's voice. Today, the financial competition started, so the guy turned away and tried not to think about it. The hero took out his personal laptop from his backpack. Suddenly, from the general chat, he learned that Rachel had already entered the market. The guy grabbed his head, realizing his too-easy victory over the girl. The young man began to get nervous after reading the words of the headman, who pretended to be a professional in the field of trading. He didn't like the fact that some of his classmates simply flattered the innocent girl. Meanwhile, Brittany was bragging about her future victory, with a frustrated Rachel sitting next to her. Suddenly, David received a message from her asking about useful promotions. Soon, the main character sent a screenshot of the most profitable promotion to the general chat. Suddenly, some students began to express their dissatisfaction with the fact that the guy was not following the pattern he taught them, and this made him nervous. A drop of sweat rolled down the young man's face as one of the participants decided to make him the target of criticism. David's attention was drawn to Rachel's interest in his strategy. The young man explained the meaning of his scheme to his comrades and felt incredibly cool. But his mood immediately changed to the opposite when he did not see a single reaction to his message. After a few seconds, his classmates finally thanked him and asked him to explain everything in more detail tomorrow. He wasn't going to take such a risk. Brittany, who was in a fast food restaurant, recognized the hero's talent for expressing his thoughts beautifully. Rachel stared at her phone screen in fear, not wanting to lose to David. The next day, the hero came to the classroom, and the class monitor was already sitting next to his seat. He began to sit down on the chair, asking the girl about her success with stocks. She didn't even look in his direction and advised him to stop being so self-confident. The next moment, Rachel turned to the protagonist and, pointing her finger at him, promised to get around him soon. He responded by saying that they needed to put aside past grievances since they were now working in the same industry. The guy then invited the girl to have lunch together, but she was burning with anger. The head woman stared at the table, needing to concentrate on monitoring the exchange data. Before leaving, David kindly wished his friend good luck in this difficult task. When he arrived at the cafeteria and sat down on a chair, he took out his phone and was immediately called out by a familiar voice. At the other end of the room, the young man saw Nancy waving happily at him. The young man became wary for a second. She probably had a hidden agenda. A few seconds later, the main character approached the table where the university's main beauty, Ruby, and an unfamiliar guy were sitting. The girl with the bob politely invited David to sit next to them. He was a little confused because his last meeting with Nancy had not gone very well. Suddenly, a guy sitting at the table addressed the main character. The young man turned to him and asked who he was. Then the stranger called the young man not so special. Nancy asked him to be more polite. Soon, David sat down on a chair next to the red-haired beauty, trying not to pay attention to the unpleasant guy. The main character immediately realized that the person sitting in front of him was none other than Richard, who said that Nancy's status would be lowered if she continued to be friends with the guy. The arrogant guy also looked at the girl, mentioning that the young man had made her wait. The university's most beautiful woman opened her eyes wide and hastened to moderate the student's ardor. In her opinion, there was nothing wrong with that. Nancy noted David's thirst for learning in order to get rich, but in reality, she wanted to get back at him for the incident in the restaurant. The girl also remembered the unpleasant words of her father, who ordered her to spend more time with the main character. Suddenly, the young man put his hand on the red-haired girl's head and apologized for all his bad deeds. Nancy looked at him with her unusual eyes filled with incomprehension. David smiled wickedly, revealing his white teeth. The guy turned to her and asked her to listen to him next time when he asks her not to wait for him. The university's most beautiful woman gritted her teeth. Now the initiative passed into the hero's hands. Ruby and Richard froze, watching this unusual scene. The girl couldn't believe that he touched her head. Her plan began to collapse. Nancy felt awkward. She couldn't allow the young man to disgrace herself. She turned away for a second and finally decided to use her trump card. A few moments later, the girl pierced David with a magical look that was supposed to make him apologize for what he had done. The main character looked at Nancy in bewilderment, not understanding what she was doing. Soon an awkward pause arose between them, causing them to experience incredible discomfort. The beauty became nervous because her enchanting gaze had absolutely no effect on the young man. The girl used this technique since birth. It helped her to force adults to calm her down. Richard looked with displeasure at Nancy, for whom he secretly had feelings. He jumped up from his chair and, clenching his fist, scolded the hero for touching his girlfriend's head. His face expressed the anger that began to overwhelm the guy. The beauty did not want to show her true emotions, so she politely asked David not to do this anymore, because it spoils her hairstyle. Richard was stunned, expecting his girlfriend to react more violently to this impudent fellow. Suddenly, the main character asked the guy's name, which brought him out of his thoughts. He bowed, introduced himself, and said that he was a good friend of Mike and Ron. Then the student invited him to hang out together. David was surprised by his words. Soon the hero agreed. Richard tried to remain calm, feeling the guy's unusual aura. The young man, with a smile on his face, invited his new acquaintance to have a drink together. Richard's mouth dropped open, feeling genuine fear. This look greatly frightened the student. David bowed to him politely. The boy looked at the young man suspiciously, scared by the thought that he might attack him with the hammer that had forced Lewis to leave the dorm. Suddenly, this awkward and slightly unpleasant scene was interrupted by Ruby, who brought soup for the main character. He thanked the girl with all his heart for her concern and took the tray from her hands. Richard was filled with anger at how the boy could so skillfully control his gaze. David broke into a wide smile, delighted at his triumph. After that, he looked at the tray and noticed something strange. It had no cutlery. Ruby apologized for her absent-mindedness and promised to bring them right away. Suddenly, the main character raised his hand and asked the girl to stay in her place. Next, the young man took out a box that looked very expensive and elite. Inside was a spoon and fork made entirely of rare rose gold. The guy himself used a fork and decided to lend the spoon to Nancy. Soon the girl, who had no strength left to be angry with him, carefully examined the expensive cutlery. Richard's eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw his girlfriend using such a simpleton's cutlery. The student grabbed his head and screamed, imagining a scenario in which the couple would feed each other. The guy soon calmed down, remembering Rachel, who could not allow David to improve his relationship with Nancy. After some time, Ruby and the university's most beautiful girl were in the bedroom. Suddenly, the girl with the bob asked her friend about her relationship with the main character. The head of the finance class asked Nancy to just give her a hint, and she would deal with David right away. She, sitting on her bed, asked her friend not to worry about it. A few seconds later, Ruby took her beige jacket off the hanger. She then pulled it over her shoulders and said that she had never seen a situation like what was happening to the university beauty. Nancy wished her friend a good rest, and she thanked her and said goodbye. After Ruby left, the girl lay down on the bed and covered herself with her strawberry print blanket. The university's most beautiful girl thought about the absurdity and strangeness of the current situation. She was lost in memories of the good times she had had, burning through her rich father's money. One day, an unknown girl approached her. Fear was evident on her face. She asked Nancy to pay off her debts, which were a trifle to her. She turned to her, showing her confused look. The university's most beautiful woman sat down on her bed, thinking about her uselessness to people richer than her. The girl's amazing eyes exuded melancholy, because she was not needed even by the poor. Next, she looked at the notebook left by Ruby, who almost always abandoned it in difficult situations. Nancy stared into space, thinking about how she had few close and loyal friends since childhood. She began to look like an upset child who had lost her favorite toy. Suddenly, the girl hit the pillow with her fist, blaming the main character for all her troubles. Nancy was filled with anger towards David. The situation in the dining room today appeared before her eyes again. The girl fell face down on the pillow, trying to forget about this shame. Soon she looked away, thinking about the incredible courage of the hero and Rachel. Suddenly, the door to the dorm room opened, making a nasty creak. An excited Ruby ran inside, hurrying to tell her friend the important news. The girl abruptly lifted her face from the pillow, her face expressing incomprehension of what was happening. The head of the finance class took out her phone and showed her the list of the best students participating in the competition. David was in 9th place. Nancy looked closely at the smartphone screen with her unusual eyes. Ruby, putting her hand to her chest, called the hero a real expert in the field of trading. Suddenly, the university's most beautiful girl smiled strangely and admitted that this guy was amazing. The girl with the bob haircut looked at her friend in surprise, for whom such words were unusual. She just laughed sarcastically and smiled sweetly. Nancy then picked up her phone, deciding to help the protagonist increase his authority. A couple of days later, the students in David's class were discussing the list heatedly. Brittany stared at her smartphone and Rachel turned around. She noticed one of the students congratulating Alan on his first place in the ranking. The narcissistic guy was reveling in his victory, but was already mentally prepared for the hero to use his hidden trump card. Suddenly, he was interrupted by Claire, who closed her textbook and was about to leave so as not to see the guy bragging. Alan turned to her and called these words too harsh. He also added that David had only an average performance in practice, and the head girl heard all of this. Suddenly, Brittany's mouth opened wide, and she asked everyone present to check the forum immediately. Finally, the main character entered the classroom. The students looked at him strangely. The young man froze for a second, not understanding what was going on. Suddenly, he heard a voice from the loudspeaker congratulating him on the honorable 7th place he had taken at the end of the first week of the competition. The hero grabbed his forehead, remembering that the rating of the participants was now updated in real time. One of the students appeared right in front of him and praised him for his efforts. The next moment, Tina ran up to the main character and called him the pride of the class. The guy pushed his girlfriend away from him, and his other classmates also congratulated him. Among them was Sam, who noted the extraordinary courage of the young man. Soon, Alan appeared next to them, saying that he didn't even notice the young man. Suddenly, Tina opened her mouth in fear, because her friend might lose the bet. David hastened to reassure her, telling her about the increase in the price of the shares Rachel had bought. At that very moment, the headman approached him and announced that she had sold them that morning. The main character froze and began to stare at her with a puzzled look. This scene was interrupted by Brittany, who asked her friend about her progress. The girl folded her hands and confidently declared that her profit amounted to a whole $1,000. David became nervous. His face was covered in cold sweat. The headman only repeated after him. The next morning, they crossed paths at the stadium. Rachel wished the guy good morning. Surprisingly, the main character seemed to not pay attention to her and began to silently walk away. When his girlfriend asked him why he was doing this, the young man replied that almost every meeting with her ended in trouble for him. The young man turned to Rachel and asked with displeasure how long she was going to repeat after him. The head girl tried to explain her actions using the words of Teacher Thomas. In her opinion, all means are fair in stock trading, which amazed the main character. The girl threw up her hands and called the incident a trifle. She then took out her phone to show David the group where the girls were confessing their love to him. A moment later, the young man walked away, surprising the elder. On the way, he thought about the suspiciously quick response to his achievement. The young man looked at the students running around the stadium, deciding that he was being watched. Rachel looked at David with displeasure, noticing the change in his expression. Suddenly, she noticed 3 students gathered around the board. The girl immediately grabbed the main character by the hand and led him there. The guy read the congratulations on reaching 7th place, which was addressed to him. Rachel let out a joyful squeal, thinking he deserved a prize for that. 3 students discussed the futility of such a small victory. The headman immediately approached them and ordered them to show respect to the boy. 2 students, who turned out to be from the International Exchange Department, just laughed at her words. This made the headman very angry, and she began to burn with rage. Suddenly, one of the girls recognized her as the student who, according to rumors, was dating Nancy. The main character tried to stop his friend, but she was not going to just leave. Then, with a smile on his face, he offered to at least let go of his hand. Rachel released him from her tight grip and began to curse. The guy tried to calm her down. Students from the International Exchange Department observed their quarrel. One of them made a sarcastic joke about the relationship between David and the head girl, because, as he had heard, she was a lesbian. At that very moment, Rachel stopped her verbal altercation with the hero and headed towards the Joker. The frightened young man reminded his friend that fighting was prohibited on campus, hoping that this would stop her. Suddenly, the girl stopped and, looking angrily at the student, called him Nancy's pet dog. These words made the 3 of them freeze in bewilderment. One of the students suggested that her friends get out of here, at which point the main character laughed loudly. He explained this by saying that he was surprised by the girl's self-control. Rachel called them just people who were jealous of David and walked away. He, left alone, acknowledged this fact. Suddenly, he ran up to the head girl and, putting his hand on her head, declared that he didn't care what these students thought. The girl abruptly pulled his hand away from her and threatened him with her fist. Meanwhile, Principal Hector informed Nancy that her request to hang posters on campus had been fulfilled. The man asked the girl drinking tea about the benefit that David would receive. Not hearing a clear answer, he was surprised and decided to personally find out about the hero's past. The main beauty put the cup on the table thinking about the popularity that had fallen upon the young man like a storm. She started to ruffle her hair. The only thing that could interfere with her plan was the guy's bad results. Meanwhile, the main character was sitting at his laptop in the dorm room. Suddenly, the door opened, and Mike and Ron walked in, discussing the fact that their neighbor had placed 7th out of 800,000 participants. When they noticed David in front of them, they were very scared. The big guy offered him to have a snack with them of delicious dumplings with shrimp. The young man explained in a calm tone that he had already eaten. The boys, eating dumplings, discussed the strange state of the university. Posters praising the hero were posted everywhere. Then the young man asked his comrades if there were any outstanding students in their group. Ron explained that their class was not a role model, since most students did not understand even regular lectures. Mike said that many of his classmates were jealous of David. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a big guy, who said that Richard was asking about the main character again. The guy in sunglasses admitted that the congratulations were too timely, since the end of the competition was still far away. He turned to the young man and admitted that the excessive attention being shown to him was very harmful. He looked at Mike silently. His words seemed quite wise to him. The young man then crossed his arms over his chest and stared at the wall, deciding that either Richard or Nancy could be behind all of this. The main character decided to deal with this issue himself. Mike and Ron decided to take a little walk. David's face fell. Now losing the competition would be a fatal blow to his reputation. He put his hands on the keyboard, wanting to earn a few more points to increase his chances of winning. A few minutes later, the stock market finally opened, and the guy was filled with motivation to be the best. 5 hours later, he happily noted that his profits had increased by as much as 25%. Now the main character reached for the laptop in order to stabilize his profits and not suffer losses in the future. At that very moment, his phone vibrated, receiving a message. In it, Rachel told him that Teacher Thomas wanted to see the two of them in his office, which made David wary. There, an angry man criticized the girl for an incident that occurred at the stadium. He then threatened to remove her from her position as head girl, and Rachel's face was sad. Soon, this unpleasant scene was interrupted by the main character, who suddenly entered the office. Teacher Thomas raised his hand and asked the young man to come to him quickly. He expected a serious conversation, so he was very nervous, but the man asked about his success in the competition. Then the teacher, who had suddenly become kinder, offered to bring the hero a glass of water. Suddenly, Thomas asked the girl to wait outside the door. She immediately headed for the exit. Rachel walked past David, making him feel slightly uncomfortable. After this, the man praised the young man, thanks to whom their department was now on everyone's lips. The main character raised his hand. He was afraid that the teacher wanted to scold him for what happened in the morning. In response to these concerns, Thomas only laughed. He had no desire to scold the student. David breathed a sigh of relief and, putting his hand to his chest, asked not to punish his friend because she only stood up for him. The teacher waved his hand, making it clear that the main character need not worry about this. The man leaned on the table and promised to reward the head man for standing up for her comrade. He then waved his finger and asked David to give his best in this competition. Soon the teacher put a folder in front of the guy with documents required for the student council, which he could fill out if he wanted. He also promised rewards for winning the competition, and the young man felt uneasy from the excessive attention to his person. Thomas also expressed a desire to talk to his parents when they arrive in the capital, in order to be happy for their son. The protagonist felt a little uncomfortable because the man was trying to find out more about his past. Suddenly, the teacher mentioned the director's morning call, who asked about the boy's progress. He was surprised. David froze for a second, realizing that Nancy was behind all of this, since Richard did not have that kind of power. Feeling something was wrong, the main character said goodbye to the teacher and headed for the exit. As soon as he opened the door, he immediately became immersed in thoughts about the true goals of the university's main beauty. In the corridor, he bumped into Rachel, who began asking him about what had happened in the office. The young man explained to her that Thomas was only talking about the importance of his victory in the financial competition. After this, the guy suggested that they return to the classroom as soon as possible, which surprised the girl. A moment later, the couple's classmates greeted them with thunderous applause. Teacher Thomas congratulated them on being ranked first and third among the best students in their class. David and Rachel's mouths dropped open in shock at the news. The young man looked at the headman, who had achieved such success by repeating after him. Suddenly, the girl turned to the guy and suggested that they call off their argument. A little later, the two of them headed to their seats. Brittany complimented the main character. The young man, sitting down on a chair, asked his friend why they should cancel the bet. The girl explained to him that the gap between them was too big, so she had no chance. The head woman lowered her eyes and sadness was reflected on her face. David turned to Rachel and asked her not to stop halfway. She began to make dissatisfied refusals, realizing that she would never be able to defeat such a talented guy. A few hours later, the hero started working on his computer and learned some unpleasant news. The headman had sold absolutely all of her shares. The young man brought his ballpoint pen to his face and was surprised. It seemed that the girl had decided to leave the competition completely, for which the teacher had already scolded her. The protagonist immediately realized that this was connected with his desire to drag her into the arena of real trading and disgrace her. He looked up and looked downcast because his frivolity had caused Rachel to give up the opportunity to become rich and famous. A picture appeared before his eyes of Alan and Sam competing with each other while the headman raised the white flag and surrendered. He also remembered her determined look. Such a decision was not typical for the girl. Suddenly, the guy stretched and became afraid that Rachel might also abandon the affair, fearing competition. The protagonist was reading a university forum where students were discussing his success in a competition when suddenly he was startled by a loud sound. The young man turned around abruptly and saw Teacher Thomas and Principal Hector entering the room. The teacher introduced him to the head of the university and a man named Erwin, who was the head of the finance department. Erwin, who looks like a man with a slight receding hairline, praised the boy's intelligence and desire to study. The head of the finance department shook David's hand in gratitude for the glory he had brought to the university. He was also congratulated by a guy with glasses named Leslie, who is the student council president. He then introduced the hero to a green-haired girl named Sophie, who was in charge of advertising for the student council. Hector raised his finger and, with a smile on his face, explained to David that they wanted to interview him, but first he wanted to talk to him in private. He also asked the main character for his suggestions regarding the development of the university, and the young man became nervous. Suddenly, Thomas put his hand on his shoulder and promised to help him in a difficult situation. Erwin put his hand to his mouth and promised to hold a place for the young man in the International Council Department if he won. He also said that the university would cover any expenses during the exchange period. The uninvited guests stared at the protagonist. Sophie's eyes widened because this was the first time in her life she had heard such a generous offer. Leslie felt a little bad because he had been trying to get this opportunity for a long time, and David got it so easily. The main character looked carefully at those present and felt slightly uncomfortable. He leaned against the bed and confidently declared that he did not need their encouragement. The unexpected guests froze upon hearing this. His answer was too harsh. A moment later, Hector clapped the young man on the shoulder and wished him luck. Immediately after this, the director said goodbye to the student and headed for the exit. Teacher Thomas reminded the main character about the interview they wanted to take from him. Leslie then handed David an envelope containing interview questions. He glanced at the papers and thanked the guy. Before leaving, Erwin advised the young man to have a good rest and not worry about anything. Suddenly, the girl with green hair turned around and cast a strange look at the young man. Soon Sophie approached him and offered to exchange contacts to become friends on a social network. All this time she looked at him with her beautiful eyes. David looked at her and lied about how he rarely used social media. Sometime later, Hector visited Ethan's office and reported to him about the hero's success in the financial competition. Suddenly, a man in glasses put an envelope with an advertising offer from the university on the table. The director of the educational institution, scratching his head, called it Nancy's merit, because if it weren't for her, the management might not have even known about David's talent. Ethan looked out the window and asked Hector about the girl's request. He raised his hand and explained that she asked him not to tell the main character about her attitude towards what was happening. A man in glasses and a formal suit told the director about his fleeting acquaintance with the young man. A few seconds later, Ethan signed the paper, which allowed Nancy's plan to go ahead. He then handed it to Hector, smiling, and advised him to increase David's bonus a little. The university director happily promised to immediately begin fulfilling his request. When Hector left the office, he broke into a wide smile, having received the long-awaited chance for a promotion. He then walked down the corridor, thinking about the friendly relations between Mr. Anthony, his friends, and David. He immediately realized that there was an unusual connection between the young man and Nancy. The director stopped and decided at all costs to put the guy on the podium so that the girl's father would praise him. Immediately after this, Hector joyfully threw his head up, because this was his chance to bask in the rays of glory. Soon the man took his phone out of his pocket and decided to report to the university's most beautiful woman that her request had been fulfilled. At this time, Nancy was in her classroom talking to Ruby. She was distracted by a sudden call from Hector. The girl almost instantly put the phone to her ear and began listening to his report. The other students turned to her, hearing her request to bring David to the attention of the administration. An agitated Ruby asked her friend what had happened, and she was clearly unhappy with what was happening. The director happily told the main beauty of his university about the outstanding talents of the young man. A few seconds later, the girl abruptly hung up, surprising the man. Hector walked further down the corridor, lost in dreams of his future promotion. Meanwhile, Ruby looked at her friend, who had become suspiciously gloomy and sullen after the phone conversation. Suddenly, Richard approached them and suggested that Nancy go to an expensive restaurant, which the main character clearly could not afford. The angry girl stood up from her chair and ordered the guy to shut up immediately. She then pressed her hand against the student's chest and rudely asked him to stop talking about David. After this, the upset university beauty headed towards the exit of the auditorium. Richard asked her to listen to him. After a couple of seconds, all he could do was look after her. Her constantly changing mood alerted the guy. Soon, Nancy was walking down the street with her eyes downcast. Her plan to manipulate the hero had failed, and now everyone was talking only about him. After some time, she asked her personal driver to take her home. When she arrived there, she met a maid who told her that her father was looking for the girl. The university's most beautiful woman stared at the floor, anticipating a rather unpleasant conversation. Suddenly, Anthony approached her and began asking about his daughter's relationship with David. Meanwhile, the protagonist finally finished writing 3 chapters of the novel and was about to send them to Rachel. He was distracted by his own phone, which suddenly vibrated. The young man took it in his hands and was very surprised. On his smartphone screen, he saw a message from Judy, with whom he had not spoken for about 10 days. The girl asked the guy about his affiliation with the finance department, which confused him a little. The stunned young man decided to ask his friend why she needed this information. She was in her room, dressed in a very revealing outfit. One of her friends told her about a genius who appeared in David's class. Judy sprawled out on her bed and said that this friend had a brother who lived in the same area as the hero. Then she said that they were going to visit him, so they would be able to meet the young man. He tensed up. The young man scratched his chin and, after some thought, decided to meet with an old acquaintance. After that, he began to devour his instant noodles while thinking about how to spend the next day off. At this time, Nancy sat alone in the giant living room of her family mansion. She jumped in fear when she heard her father's voice behind her. The girl immediately turned to him, making cute eyes, and suggested talking tomorrow. Anthony tried to convince his daughter, but to no avail. Suddenly, Nancy was hugged by her mother, Vanessa, who was overjoyed to see her again. The woman then promised to listen to her beloved daughter and share valuable advice. The girl closed her eyes and said that she was fine, so her parents had no reason to worry. Soon she asked her father why he started the conversation by mentioning David. The man hesitated a little and admitted to losing a fairly large sum of money during an unsuccessful trade in his shares. Dissatisfied with this, Nancy rather harshly scolded Anthony for such a frivolous attitude towards the family's finances. The girl's father coughed into his hand. Ethan told him about the talent of one of the students in the field of trading, so he asked his daughter to invite him here. The university's most beautiful girl made a displeased face, because this meant that she would have to bring David into her own home. Vanessa supported her husband and asked her daughter to do the same. The woman then put her hand on her shoulder and asked her not to worry about the family budget. Nancy became very nervous when she realized that her parents suspected her of having a love affair with the hero, which in fact did not exist. This made the girl jump up from the sofa and call David's visit to the house impossible. She turned to her mother and lied about her concerns that the boy was too young to give trading advice. A worried Vanessa tried to calm her daughter down and suggested testing the boy and inviting Rachel, with whom she thought Nancy was friends. Vanessa placed her hands on her chest and invited her daughter to have dinner with her new friends. Nancy reluctantly agreed and walked away, her mother feeling slightly embarrassed. When the girl disappeared from sight, her parents began to discuss her strange attitude towards the opposite sex. Vanessa put her index finger forward and spoke about the benefits of the protagonist's future visit. Her husband leaned back in his chair and expressed concern that his daughter might not appreciate their parental care. Anthony sighed heavily and looked down, because his little girl had grown up. The morning came and David was awakened by the sound of the telephone, so he tried to wake up. The guy picked up the phone and saw a notification on the screen. To his surprise, the hero received a sudden message from Nancy. The student went into the messenger and learned about a meeting scheduled for the following evening with the girl's father, who had heard about the student's success in the competition. The protagonist raised his heavy eyelids and saw another message. Rachel was also invited to the meeting. David soon recovered from the unexpected news and began to get out of bed. He climbed down from the second tier, deciding to meet with the headman an hour before the appointed meeting. The student went to the bathroom and started brushing his teeth. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Judy inviting the young man to have lunch together, as she would be arriving very soon. After some time, she was standing on the street in the company of her friend and animatedly looking at her watch, waiting for the main character to appear. Finally, she heard a painfully familiar voice and turned around happily. Behind her, Judy saw an attractive guy waving at her. The girl was very surprised and had difficulty recognizing her old friend in him. The student had changed a lot. She smiled sweetly and paid her friend a few compliments. The next moment, Judy introduced David to her companion, whose name was Catherine. After this, the girl introduced her friend to the guy, calling him a real financial genius. The student's new acquaintance quickly extended her hand to him. The hero shook hands with her, and looking at the grinning Judy, admitted that the situation was rather awkward. Suddenly, a young man ran up to the trio and greeted his sister Catherine. It turned out to be none other than Mike, trying to catch his breath after a long run to the meeting place. The main character looked at his roommate in bewilderment. The blonde girl greeted him happily. The face of the arriving student changed dramatically when he saw David holding his beloved sister's hand. The next second, there was an awkward silence between them. Concerned, Catherine turned to her brother in fear, but he remained silent. Then she kindly asked Mike to come closer. The unsuspecting girl tried to introduce her brother to the hero. David's old friend clenched his fist, not believing that he had decided to court Catherine. Judy, realizing that the situation was tense, finally suggested that her friends have lunch. A few moments later, she handed David her bag and Catherine's bag so she wouldn't have to carry it herself. The girl then headed towards her friend and along the way thanked the young man for his help. The guy sighed heavily, looking after his friend walking ahead. Mike's eyes filled with fear, and beads of sweat began to roll down his face as he looked ahead. The main character walked between two girls, kindly helping them carry their bags. The guy was irritated by the smile on his roommate's face, plus he always carried his sister's bag. Mike was filled with anger, his teeth bared and his eyebrows tense. Immediately, a terrifying picture appeared before him, as if Catherine had married David, and he would now have to become his relative. Soon the hero turned to Mike, who was lagging behind, and began to turn his head. At that very moment, the guy, still not having recovered from his bad thoughts, loudly asked what his son-in-law was doing here. After this phrase, silence hung in the air. Everyone was in a state of mild shock. Suddenly, Judy burst into loud laughter and even grabbed her stomach, which began to hurt from it. She turned to the protagonist and asked when he had become Mike's son-in-law. Suddenly, the boy received a blow to the head from his sister, who clearly did not appreciate his prank. A lump appeared on the student's head, and it appeared to be from the blow, and he decided that his relationship with David would help him avoid suffering at his hands. After this, Catherine lashed out at her poor brother, accusing him of tactlessness and ignorance towards what she considered to be a new acquaintance. Soon, Mike put his hand on the hero's shoulder and decided to explain. David stepped forward and allowed the guy to call him whatever he wanted, which made him furious. Judy, wiping away tears from her eyes from all the laughter, finally offered her friends something to eat. At that moment, the hapless brother seemed to be paralyzed, his eyes and mouth wide open. He immediately grabbed his sister by the hand and advised her to follow him to a good place. A little later, they entered a small cafeteria where there were several people. Suddenly, Judy accidentally slipped and began to fall on the floor, but the main character caught her in time. The girl instantly stood up and glanced at the student, who, apparently, had gotten the hang of it by helping his other friends. Suddenly, they were interrupted by a loud female voice calling out to the hero. Behind her, Judy saw a girl with short red hair, wearing a pink top. David froze, Tina's sudden appearance startling him a little. She smiled strangely and walked towards the guy with a very unusual gait. The main character turned his head to the side and explained that this was his former classmate. Then the red-haired student quickly turned around and glanced at Judy. Suddenly, she called the embarrassed girl David's ex-lover. She was very surprised to hear these words. Then Tina turned to the hero and asked him to introduce them better. In fact, the student was overwhelmed by a sudden feeling of envy. She looked greedily at Judy, who had a magnificent face and figure. David's old friend asked him to introduce her to his classmate, and he started to rush around. Suddenly, Tina said her name and introduced herself to her. Judy felt a little confused. What was happening seemed a little strange to her. Soon, she reached for the red-haired student's hand. Then, the girl gave her name and introduced herself as a former classmate of the main character. Suddenly, Tina began to praise the guy, talking about his success in his studies and communication with his fellow students. These words had an unpleasant effect on David. He felt awkward and embarrassed. Suddenly, Judy straightened her hair with her hand and noted the hero's outstanding abilities. She approached him and reminded him of the compliments from her father. The student almost jumped up from his seat. What was happening looked awkward and a little disgusting. Judy then whispered to the guy that they should discuss what had happened at the university in more detail. The hero froze and decided not to interfere in the conversation so as not to further aggravate the situation. Tina's face filled with disappointment when she learned about her friend's meeting with Judy's parents. Suddenly, David's former classmate clung to her and asked if there was any progress in her relationship with him. The girl smiled sweetly and pointed out to the student his pickiness. After that, Judy offered her help and let go of her new acquaintance's hand. The hero's old acquaintance put her hand to her chest and felt some relief. David looked away to avoid being involved in his friend's conversation. Tina thanked the girl reluctantly, her face not expressing trust. Suddenly, in the middle of the room, Catherine's hand was raised and her voice was heard calling her friends. Judy clasped her hands and came up with a cunning plan. She pulled her blonde friend towards her and declared that she also really liked the main character. The girl made up the story of how they met, and Catherine was in an awkward position. Soon Judy turned to her companion and asked her to play along a little. Tina was very angry when she learned about another potential rival. Then the red-haired student noticed David standing to the side. Her gaze was caught by the guy's condescending look and smile. Tina immediately became embarrassed and blushed with shame. She was suddenly interrupted by Rachel, who appeared out of nowhere. Judy and Catherine froze in place when the head girl turned her attention to them. Pairs of girls began to stare at each other. Something interesting was brewing. Rachel then extended her hand and introduced herself as the head of David's group. Sweat began to roll down the nervous protagonist's face. He wanted to fall through the ground. He looked at the head of his group, who had an unbearable and unpredictable character. On the other hand, there was Judy, who was the girl of his dreams. David grabbed his head and became nervous. He was faced with a difficult choice. Surprisingly, Judy smiled and began to get acquainted with the headman. Rachel narrowed her eyes when she realized that the person standing in front of her was an old acquaintance of the hero. Suddenly, she smiled and called her the guy's ex-lover, which of course was a lie. Judy put her fingers to her lips, the words taking her by surprise. Then she opened her mouth and told her opponents that they were thinking too much. After that, the girl smirked and explained the truth. The main character had never had a girlfriend. Soon, Judy approached the guy and rose on her toes. Their eyes met. David felt awkward and nervous. The girl said that he was in love now. Rachel and Tina were embarrassed, the situation clearly causing them to misunderstand. The head girl looked at the student who was trying to cover his bashful face. Her eyebrows furrowed, the corners of her lips turned down, and she began to get angry. Rachel clenched her fist, not liking their drawn-out love story. Suddenly, the headman declared that the hero would not suffer from secret love. She called the girl who wanted David's attention too arrogant. Judy turned her head. Her gaze became a little upset. These words hurt her right in the heart. Then the girl bowed and admitted that the headman understood the feelings of the main character much better. She also added that she doesn't understand who he fell in love with. Judy pointed at Tina and Rachel, who were confused and froze in surprise at this assumption, which was the pure truth. The red-haired student, frightened by the class monitor's reaction, said that she was ready to simply admire David from the side. She also added that many students were running after him. These words caused Rachel to feel a slight feeling of disgust. Judy and the confused guy listened attentively to Tina's unusual speech. Suddenly, she turned to the hero's former classmate with a sly grin on her face. The girl hinted at the domineering and unpleasant character of the student's supposed lover, and Judy felt uneasy. She suddenly froze in amazement when Tina called David the university's heartthrob. The girl remembered his old glasses and unruly hair. Surprisingly, Judy thanked the students for changing the guy for the better. The red-haired girl smiled and mentioned the hero's daily treats in the dining room. These words, like a lit fuse, caused David to burst into loud words about why they were bragging about this. Judy then made fun of the student's inability to even feed himself. Suddenly, she grabbed the protagonist by the ear and demanded an explanation, because he had enough money left over from buying the house. David felt uncomfortable and asked to let go of his ear, promising to explain. The guy rubbed the pinched area and tried to come to his senses after what had happened. Tina was very surprised to learn that David had purchased an entire house. Rachel's eyes widened, thinking that the hero was going to move back to his hometown after finishing his studies. She looked at Judy's caresses, and it seemed to her as if this was all planned by his family, who wanted a worthy bride for their son. Suddenly, the student mentioned the alleged remaining money. He tried to explain to Judy that he had to choose another house with a higher price. After this, he grabbed his chest and declared that he was now left with only a measly $300. Besides, the guy can't ask his family for money. Because the school year has just begun, Katrin was amazed by his story. A little later, The main character shed a tear and asked those present for sympathy for himself. Judy's friend noted the correctness of the guy's investment of money, but she thought otherwise, because for the most part it was money received as compensation for John's actions. An angry Judy scolded the student for his love of free food. Then David explained that he was worthy of his gratitude to his generous friends, but the girl did not care about these words. Suddenly, a message from the system appeared in front of him, telling him that he had received a skill that would allow him to seize the opportunity. Tina froze in amazement, not believing that Judy was capable of grabbing a guy by the ear and scolding him. Rachel looked away and decided that David's former classmate was the cause of everything that was happening. Suddenly, the head girl seemed to be on fire with a desire for revenge. In her opinion, Judy was preventing the student from becoming the CEO from her novel. Then she called out to the main character's former classmate, calling her fat. Rachel ordered the girl to stop interfering in their relationship. Judy didn't immediately realize that the headman was talking to her, so she was confused. She tried to point out Rachel's plumpness, but was immediately taken with her almost magnificent figure. Judy then turned to the hero and complained that she was being bullied. She pointed her finger at Tina and the headman, who were getting on her nerves. The girl also rudely asked if he considered her his friend. The establishment's visitors were surprised by the presence of such a large number of beautiful girls fighting over one guy. An agitated David began to blame Rachel, because it was she who insulted his former classmate. He massaged the area between his eyebrows and decided to carefully resolve the situation. He then turned to Judy and called her his friend. She sighed with relief and apologized for being overly emotional. Suddenly, the main character thanked her for introducing him to his friend. He placed his hand on his forehead and proudly declared that he had finally been able to experience love at first sight. The guy then turned to Catherine and asked her to be his girlfriend. Judy, Tina, and Rachel's mouths dropped open at this unexpected turn of events. The girl blushed with shame and looked into David's eyes, not believing her ears. Suddenly, she remembered her urgent business and immediately ran away, covering her face with her hand. Judy turned towards the hero, clearly confused by what had happened. Then the guy explained to the girl that he had always considered her only his best friend. Her face became lost and upset, her eyes filled with regret. She began to wrinkle her skirt, simultaneously scolding herself for her overly violent reaction. Tina grabbed her head, still not believing what had happened, while Rachel smiled, having seen through the student's lie. Judy glared at them because they were the ones who started this mess. Suddenly, the hero turned to the headman, calling her by a pseudonym from the short story website, and she got scared. Her face turned red with embarrassment and her eyes filled with fear. Rachel immediately realized that the guy knew that she copied his image for the character in her novel. The scene of the director and Emily kissing, which he most likely saw, immediately came to her mind. The girl felt uneasy. All her secrets threatened to burst out. Then she tried to correct the situation and, turning her head to the side, admitted that she was wrong. Tina noticed a strange change in her friend's behavior and became nervous. Judy narrowed her eyes and acknowledged the protagonist's imperiousness. She then apologized to the guy for making the escalating conflict worse. The girl then turned to Tina and asked her for forgiveness. The red-haired student was greatly frightened by Judy's sudden change in mood. She put her hand to her cheek and called her overly polite. Tina also thanked her for introducing David to Catherine, and the girl smiled hysterically. Suddenly, the main character fixed a menacing look on his classmates and suggested that they leave quickly. Rachel and Tina smiled nervously and quickly walked away. The guy grabbed his head and sighed. This unpleasant situation was finally over. For resolving the conflict, the system awarded the student a large number of points. He was suddenly distracted by Judy, who asked if he had really fallen in love with Catherine. The main character made a stupid joke but did not give a clear answer. The girl asked if her character irritated him. He stared at her and admitted that Rachel felt much more powerful. Then the guy said a smart phrase about the torments of love, and Judy smiled. The hero advised his friend to become more strict. She was surprised. David explained that people need to take more active control over the relationship process. Suddenly, the girl seemed to light up and suggested trying to do it. Blushing a little with embarrassment, she explained that she had fallen in love with the guy the first time they met on the train. David was surrounded by a large number of girls, so she needed to act right now. The student's mouth dropped open in surprise. The hero put his hands forward, as if defending himself from her words, and suggested waiting a little. He blushed and covered his face with his hand, just as the girl of his dreams confessed her love to him. Judy suggested that they get married in the future if they liked each other, and even have children. The guy was worried that they might not be right for each other. To this, the girl replied with a smile on her face that this could only be found out by trying. David froze. Deep in his soul, he dreamed of living his life with such a beautiful lover. Then the main character, a little nervous, suggested to his friend that she think about it carefully. Judy was very surprised to hear such an answer. The student grabbed his head, and his entire past life, filled with failures, flashed before his eyes. He looked at the girl and said that he was not ready for such a serious relationship yet. He should have climbed to the top of the world. The guy apologized for that. Judy's eyes filled with disappointment as she looked greedily at the hero. A little later, Rachel began to bombard David with questions about how he knew her nickname. The student did not respond to the head of the class for a long time, so she decided that he might have gone on a date with a girl from the cafe. He soon admitted that he had read it on the receipt for her recent package, and Rachel clutched her head and screamed hysterically. Suddenly, the girl's phone vibrated. The main character decided to buy some fruit and offered to go with him. A few minutes later, the headmistress was already standing in the store, dressed in a pink sweatshirt, her face upset. She suspected her classmate's secret intentions, but he insisted that he only wanted to buy some fruit. He waved his hand. In his opinion, students cannot afford more. The counter displayed a variety of fruits, from apples and bananas to peaches and oranges. Rachel concluded that these goods would be sufficient. The guy didn't understand why his girlfriend was looking at him so angrily. She was just waiting for him to finally pay. David simply waved this off, saying that the girl had chosen the fruit, so she should pay. The student turned his head and admitted that he didn't have the money for it. The headman, who had suffered enough today, was beside herself with anger. The guy started rummaging through his wallet, and the saleswoman called the relationship between what she considered to be a loving couple funny. Suddenly, Rachel's eyes widened and she looked very surprised. Her attention was drawn to David's wallet, which was stuffed with money. It was all his savings, put aside until winter. The headman called the hero's behavior selfish and wrong. Then the guy made a sarcastic remark about the possible riches of a girl who had such a large number of views on her novel. Suddenly, David received a reward from the system in the form of chewing gum, which temporarily improved his mood. Rachel loudly declared that she was not even writing the novel, but was simply helping. She looked down, afraid that her friend might know about the racy scenes that the writer was describing in detail. Finally, the main character paid for the purchase, and taking the package, admitted that he had not read the entire novel. He had only just caught a glimpse of the racy scenes, and those words hit Rachel right in the heart, leaving her dumbfounded. A little later, the couple sat in the back of a taxi, an awkward silence hanging between them. The girl kept glancing sideways at the guy and was very worried. Suddenly, she asked David about his favorite type of girl, and he reminded her of Catherine. The headman didn't believe this brazen lie one bit. Next, she asked the guy to tell her honestly about his attitude towards Nancy. The hero called her very attractive, but Rachel wanted to know about their sympathy. The student recognized her rich family, so she can't help but appeal to any guy he meets. The headmistress decided that the main character could fall in love with Nancy only because of her money and beauty. The guy immediately decided that his girlfriend was jealous of him, but she quickly denied it. Then Rachel approached a classmate and declared her love for boys, not girls. The cunning hero decided that the headman used her to write the piquant scenes of the novel, and her eyes widened. Suddenly, David approached Rachel and offered to book a hotel room for tomorrow. He would play the male lead, and she would play the female lead. The girl decided to play the queen, and the guy would be her servant, but he insisted on his own. The next moment, the head girl gave the student a rather strange look, and he felt uneasy. Rachel, blushing, explained that to come up with a character idea, a good knowledge of psychology was necessary. Suddenly, they were interrupted by a taxi driver who announced the end of the trip. The headman instantly blushed, realizing that the taxi driver had heard their conversation the whole time. David slyly offered to pay for the trip to his classmate, who reluctantly agreed. Soon she got out of the car and, scratching her head, called the conversations with the guy very tiring. A moment later, the girl froze and opened her tired eyes wide. Right in front of her on the stairs stood a smiling Nancy wrapped in a white scarf. They immediately exchanged greetings, and the headman called her mansion simply amazing. The beauty in the scarf smiled sweetly and hospitably asked her friends to contact her if necessary. The protagonist grinned nervously and thanked Nancy. A little later, the hostess led the guests inside and asked them to put on their shoes. Rachel immediately put on pink slippers on her feet, and gray ones were saved for the guy. The head woman then walked into the next room and, with her mouth wide open, suggested that this house was worth more than $15 million. At the same time, David noticed the piano standing nearby. He was eager to hear Nancy play it. Then the girl made a cheeky remark that the student didn't deserve it. Suddenly, Vanessa appeared out of nowhere and scolded her for this. A pink-haired woman dressed in an evening robe asked her daughter why she had not announced the arrival of guests. Vanessa quickly introduced herself to the protagonist and extended her hand to him. Rachel then introduced herself to her friend's mother. The woman smiled playfully and understood why Nancy could not live a second without her. After this, David, holding the bags in his hands, bowed to Vanessa and stated his name. The lady was very surprised to see the fruits that the couple brought as a gift. The woman agreed to accept the gift, but asked the guy not to do this in the future since guests are not obliged to bring gifts to the hosts. In passing, she cast her gaze at him and once again confirmed her husband's words about his politeness. A few seconds later, Vanessa asked her daughter to take Rachel to her room and call her father, who was late for a meeting with guests. Soon the woman asked the maid to bring a tray for the fruits brought by the protagonist. Then the guy, at the lady's command, put his massive bag on the table. Then the woman asked the student about his family, and he replied that he only had his parents and an aunt and uncle left. Vanessa had been to the City of Dreams many times, so she asked how things were going for its residents. According to the young man, there are still plenty of poor people there, but recently the economy has begun to develop very quickly. The woman asked how children of rich parents felt about a guy from such a town. David acknowledged the large number of conflicts over people's financial well-being and admitted that they exist throughout the country. Vanessa, having finally finished washing the fruit, called the guy's train of thought and reasoning quite serious and adult. The main character offered to help the hostess carry a tray of fruit, and she decided that he was the best candidate for the role of her daughter's assistant. In the living room, Anthony greeted the guy with loud shouts of joy. The man immediately approached him and offered him some tea. Rachel felt a little strange and uncomfortable. Vanessa slapped her hand across her face. She was very ashamed. Soon the woman got up from the sofa and offered her daughter to open a bottle of wonderful red wine in honor of the arrival of guests. Surprisingly, the girl refused and said that she wanted to drink some soda. The mother glanced at her daughter and was amazed by such an unexpected answer. Suddenly, Anthony began to praise his loose-leaf tea, hoping that his daughter would appreciate David's love for such sophisticated drinks. Deep down, the man was very worried and nervous because Nancy might not like any guys at all. The hero immediately saw through the girl's father's intentions and happily agreed to drink tea. Anthony then began pouring the drink from a small teapot directly into the student's cup, hoping that he would start a conversation about Nancy. David looked into his cup and became lost in thought about the girl's unusual surroundings and her strange train of thought. He quickly dismissed these thoughts and, smiling, decided to get to know his new girlfriend better. A joyful Anthony once again praised this type of tea and invited the guy to come visit him on weekends if he so desired. A little later, Vanessa approached Nancy and Rachel, who were sitting on the sofa, and called them to dinner. There were many snow-white plates on the table, each of them displaying an amazing delicacy. The owner of the house asked the student to sit on a chair, and he hastened to fulfill his request. There was an awkward silence between the guy and the two girls sitting next to him, and David felt uneasy. Nancy asked her neighbor to stop being so shy, but she replied that her parents were constantly staring at her. Suddenly, Anthony coughed loudly, which scared Rachel very much. Then the good-natured fat man asked the guests not to be shy and to start eating. Immediately after this, he asked the headman to make herself at home and put a small piece of delicious meat on her plate. The man gave his daughter her favorite ruddy crab. Nancy almost instantly transferred the delicacy to her friend's plate, inviting her to try it. The father, deciding that this was his daughter's way of showing love to Rachel, grabbed his head and tried to calm down. A little later, Anthony opened a bottle of red wine and poured it into his glass goblet. The good-natured owner invited the guy to have a drink with him. The main character broke into a satisfied smile and happily agreed to his proposal. Vanessa turned to her daughter and, raising her glass, hinted to her that she still had time to swap the soda for alcohol. A little embarrassed, Rachel asked her friend if she really liked the soda that much. Suddenly, the head girl stood up from her chair and, taking a glass of red wine in her hand, told Nancy that she was not going to drink that stupid soda. David looked at the headman uncertainly and began to think about how much alcohol she could drink. The guy was irritated by the thought of having to drag the drunk girl back. After just one glass, both friends were very drunk. The main character sighed heavily. Reality turned out to be much worse than his fantasy. Vanessa, slightly drunk, began to talk about her old friend, with whom she was very close and inseparable. But one day, a not very decent guy cheated on her. After that, they hardly communicated. Rachel almost jumped on the spot. Suddenly, she stood up and loudly declared that there were no good men in the world. Nancy supported her. The drunk girls began to call members of the opposite sex narcissistic scoundrels who loved to spend their lovers' money. Suddenly, Nancy said that talking about this was starting to anger her. David tried to leave quietly. Soon the friends promised to punish the scoundrels who acted like that. and the mother was very indignant at their words. The woman's eyes widened when she heard about the mysterious leash. Anthony decided that girls did not like men because they suffered from their attitude towards them. Suddenly, the man became very scared because his daughter did not have much time to suffer from love. The good-natured fat man turned to the student and assured him that people's thoughts often change. Anthony offered the protagonist a little more drink because he still had several important questions. The guy asked the man to address him with less respect so as not to embarrass him. Then the fat man laughed heartily and called David the best young man he had ever known in his life. He politely asked Anthony to stop drinking so much. He was starting to get irritated by his excessive talkativeness. Suddenly, the man grabbed the boy by the hand and said that he would be glad to see him as his son-in-law. The main character became very embarrassed and scared. The owner of the house became too straightforward. The poor student tried to evade the answer and looked away. The drunk fat man proudly declared that he would support the hero in everything. Anthony hastened to empty his glass of wine, simultaneously praising the beauty and intelligence of his beloved daughter. David was fed up with what was going on, so he made it clear that he liked Rachel. After some time, the hero was already leading the drunken headman home, holding her so that she would not fall. The girl turned to Nancy, who was not there, and asked her to pour her another glass. The guy calmed her down. The main character felt awkward being around his girlfriend, who was drunk on red wine. Rachel opened her eyes and began to slowly come to her senses after the unusual evening. Suddenly, the head woman pushed David away from her and demanded that he leave her alone. The student tried to extend his hand to her and asked her to be careful. The girl punched her chest and assured that she felt just great. Moments later, she crashed into a pole standing at the edge of the sidewalk. Rachel then began to fall backwards, but the main character managed to catch her in time. The headman fell asleep, so the boy looked at the sky and decided to stay at the hotel. Meanwhile, Vanessa covered her tired daughter with a blanket and Anthony entered the room. The man asked how Nancy was feeling, and his wife replied that she was just very tired. She then turned to her husband and suggested having an important conversation. A little later, Anthony asked Vanessa why she had such a serious expression on her face. The woman sat down on the nearby sofa and asked the man if he knew that David liked Rachel. Anthony turned pale and replied that he was no less surprised than his wife. Suddenly, Vanessa slammed her palm on the table, expressing her displeasure. She didn't like her husband's ignorance, and she began to suspect that he had mistresses. The man felt awkward because of his beloved wife's stupid and groundless suspicions. Finally, the woman calmed down and suggested continuing with the original plan. Anthony proudly assured his wife that he had given the hero a check for $70,000 to help him look after Nancy. Vanessa made a scandal again because it was unnecessary, because their daughter cannot love a guy because of his wealth. The man felt uneasy because he had completely forgotten about this development of events. His wife advised him to hold off on such important decisions and start observing the development of their relationship. The woman calmed down and compared the hero to Nancy's ex-boyfriend, who was not the most pleasant person. She sighed heavily and admitted that it was necessary for David to learn how to flirt with girls. Meanwhile, the main character carefully examined the check received from Anthony. He put it on his face and decided to rest after a hard day. Soon Rachel woke up in an unfamiliar bed. She immediately opened her eyes wide and almost screamed in surprise. The girl got out of bed and rubbed her eyes, still not believing what was happening. Right in front of her, the headman saw David sitting on a small sofa. The girl blushed and looked away, thinking that she was dreaming about him. Rachel got out of bed and walked towards what she thought was an imaginary hero. He explained to his sleepy girlfriend that he had to rent a hotel room because the hostel was closed. A few moments later, the headwoman hung herself on the boy's neck and pressed herself against him. He almost screamed in surprise. The protagonist pushed her away from him and demanded an immediate explanation. Rachel immediately frowned and became very angry at her classmate. Then the headwoman sat on his knee and scolded him for treating her like that. After that, she called David a false gentleman and complained about his character. The cruel girl said that she hated the student more than anyone in the world. Soon the girl extended her hands to the nervous hero's face. Her face turned red, her eyes became softer and more relaxed. Rachel moved closer to the guy's face and began to look at him greedily. A second later, a red stream of wine burst from her mouth and fell straight onto David's stomach. The student, who had gotten a stain on his white t-shirt, looked gloomily at his friend. He felt very uneasy. And besides, the drunk girl began to undress. She woke up the next morning and was very surprised to realize that she was in a hotel. The girl looked around nervously and was a little frightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. The head woman instantly jumped out of bed, trying to control her emotions. Memories of the previous evening flashed before her. Rachel almost instantly pulled the covers off the bed, expecting to find a half-naked David underneath. The bed was completely empty. The girl sighed with relief and decided that what happened yesterday was just her bad dream. After that, she noticed a piece of paper lying on the table. Rachel reached for the note left for her by the protagonist. Suddenly, something strange caught her attention and she turned her head to the right. Right on the sofa, there was a large red stain that looked like blood. The headman's eyes opened wide, and bad thoughts began to creep into his head. Meanwhile, the seller of a small snack bar handed the main character a tray of noodles, and he asked to let him charge his phone. As David walked away, his pocket vibrated. He took out his phone from there and received a message from the headman. The girl asked Ham to give her phone number and told him about a serious problem. At first, the guy was glad that Rachel had finally woken up. Immediately after this, he realized that he was afraid that his girlfriend had begun to guess about his second personality. The main character had to agree with the headman. He needed to give her his number. Rachel clutched her smartphone greedily as the student texted her his old number. She hurried to start the call in order to hear Ham's voice as soon as possible. The girl carefully brought the phone to her ear. Ham's voice didn't sound like David's, so the headman breathed a sigh of relief. The protagonist, who used a voice-changing program, joked about the charm his new voice had. Rachel was instantly displeased with Ham's behavior. The girl immediately told the guy about yesterday's visit to her friend. She also glanced at the sofa and told about the wine she drank and the strange discovery in the hotel room. The frightened headman asked if she could come to Ham right now. After these words, the hero, who was having delicious noodles for breakfast, vomited out what he had just put there. He instantly grabbed a napkin from the table and, wiping his face, realized that his friend most likely had not yet read his note. Rachel again reminded him of her situation and asked the guy to give her some practical advice. He asked how much charge was left on the girl's phone, and she checked it immediately. There was a red battery icon on her smartphone screen, and she urgently needed to find a charger. She quickly rummaged through the entire room, but did not find any charger. Ham suggested that the guy might have followed him to the store, and the girl agreed with his train of thought. Then the headman remembered the note he had left, and Ham asked her to be sure to call when everything was okay. After that, Rachel hung up the phone and looked around the small round table. Right on it lay a piece of paper left by the main character. In the note, the guy described the previous evening and added that he slept on the floor so as not to get dirty with red wine if the girl felt ill again. Rachel read the message carefully and realized that David had done nothing wrong to her. After some time, Tina, who was sitting on her smartphone, was distracted by the opening door of the dorm room. The head girl, who had disappeared for a while, finally returned here, and a student asked if she had spent the night at Nancy's. The girl responded to this by remaining on the street completely alone. These words greatly confused the neighbor and aroused her suspicion. Then she remembered that Rachel had left in David's company, and unpleasant thoughts crept into her mind. At this time, the main character visited one of the banks and asked to cash a check received from Nancy's father. He received messages on his phone from Tina, who was worried about the guy's confession to Katrin yesterday and the night she spent with the headman. He also received over 100 messages from Rachel, which he was not too happy about. The girl informed him of her arrival at the hostel, and he replied that he was currently shopping in search of something that would help her write her novel. The headman instantly blushed with shame, imagining various indecent things. She got very angry and, calling the guy a pervert, decided to block him. The protagonist had a lot of time left to wait for the check to be cashed, so he thought of writing to his friend. He soon found himself blocked and was a little upset. After that, the student also blocked her and smiled, imagining her reaction. A little later, the hero was walking down the street, thinking about Tina and Brittany, who had offended him a little. Then he got upset because only Rachel had shifted the blame for her actions onto him. The poor boy looked down and finally realized that the headman had always considered him trash. He looked at the sky and thought of Tina, who had fallen in love with him but was stopped by Rachel. Despite all this, he partially understood her actions. Soon, the main character stopped in front of a large building with 2 large English letters on it. He then walked inside and walked towards the girl standing behind the counter. The guy approached her and asked about the training course they offered. They showed him a poster of the course. The hero had previously trained for only half a month, but now he decided to take himself seriously. He decided to develop his basic skills on his own and entrust the additional ones to the system. The main character then signed a contract to conduct training. The student clenched his fist and looked up proudly. He needed to win Nancy over to his side and return her father's money. After some time, Thomas informed the hero that all operations of the second round of the competition were completed. After this, the man handed the student a small envelope with bonuses from the competition organization and their university. Inside, the guy found a small wad of money, a total of $1,000. A little later, Ron asked the hero if he would like to treat them to dinner, and he replied that he still had a lot of unfinished business. In fact, he received messages of praise from Tina and Brittany. David hoped to get some praise from Rachel as well, but he soon remembered that he had blocked her and laughed sarcastically. Later, the main character went to her profile and unblocked her. The student invited the girl to dinner, which will be attended by Brittany, Tina, and his roommates. The headman was burning with discontent. It was as if the guy was deliberately making fun of her. She tried to back out of the meeting, but David threatened to tell them about the interesting novel Rachel was writing. Her discontent grew even greater, but the girl had to agree to dinner. A little later, a joyful, red-haired student approached the headman and told him about the invitation from the main character. Meanwhile, Mike hesitantly asked the guy if he wanted to invite Judy and his sister to the meeting. After that, he thought for a moment about the very strange relationship between these three. Almost instantly, the hero asked his neighbor for his sister's phone number, and he flinched a little in surprise. A couple of hours later, Rachel and her friends came to the meeting. The head girl, unlike them, was dressed very unusually. David's mouth dropped open in surprise when he saw her with his own eyes. So far, they were the only ones who had come. He soon came to his senses and complimented Rachel on the black stockings she was wearing today. This unusual compliment made her feel a little awkward. After this, the main character introduced Tina and Brittany to his roommates. Mike looked after them and felt a little nervous. He began to suspect a relationship between David and the headman, which should be reported to Catherine. The guy took his phone out of his pocket and, while no one was looking, took a photo of the couple. A little later, all the assembled friends sat down at a large round table. The red-haired student picked up the menu and immediately pointed to the stewed shrimp and fried pork ribs. The hero smiled sweetly and allowed the guests to order whatever they wanted. Rachel looked down and reminded the guy of a few more of his friends he could invite. He wiped his hand with a napkin and replied that he didn't care at all. The head girl reminded her classmate of the unpleasant consequences of this decision. In response, he only smiled and called himself a selfish person. The girl looked into his eyes with bewilderment and was very surprised. Suddenly, the protagonist announced to his assembled friends that there was an important reason why he had invited them. The headman held her breath, waiting for further developments. David raised his palm and confidently declared that he was going to leave the university. A moment later, genuine fear mixed with surprise could be seen on the headman's face. She looked at the main character, calmly pouring himself some tea into a mug. Rachel looked away and asked him if he was going to go abroad. The guy was going to enroll in another university where Judy was studying. The head girl was very upset when she heard this. Her eyes filled with disappointment, but she understood why the hero might fall in love with her. Then David joked about his feelings for Judy and Catherine, which made the head girl lose her temper. He finally admitted that he had no feelings for either of the two girls, and Rachel found it hard to believe. After these explanations, the headman's face became dissatisfied again. Suddenly, it seemed like it dawned on her that this university was not on the list for transfer. The main character looked into her eyes and broke into a satisfied smile. Rachel didn't like the way he was making fun of her. She clenched her fist. Tina and Brittany were very surprised by what happened next. The headman waved her fist in front of the laughing David's face and promised to deal with him. A confused red-haired student asked her friend why she didn't act tenderly, as befits a normal woman. She was interrupted by Brittany, who decided that the guy was bullying the class leader and asked him to start hitting on Tina. There was a dead silence between the two girls, their eyes boring into each other. The next moment, they sighed in displeasure and turned their heads in different directions. The main character hinted to his dissatisfied friend that she should become kinder and more forgiving, but she insisted on her own. Suddenly, Ron jumped up from his chair and offered to treat the girls, calling them daughters-in-law, to some delicious aromatic tea. All the people gathered at the table looked at the big guy in bewilderment as he began to get nervous. Tina blushed with embarrassment and asked him not to make such harsh statements. Brittany praised the guy's politeness. Ron smiled contentedly and, putting his hand to his head, asked what kind of tea the girls preferred. The red-haired student grabbed her head and asked to bring her strawberry tea. Her friend preferred the original. The big guy then turned to Rachel, who seemed to be deliberately ignoring him. The headmistress was burning with anger because she didn't like the fact that the student called her daughter-in-law. Then Ron decided to bring her some strawberry tea and started to walk away. Mike looked after him in fear, not wanting to stay here without him. The suspicious headman asked the protagonist if the big guy's offer was part of his plan. Without waiting for an answer, she picked up the phone and was about to call Nancy to come to her aid. Concerned about this state of affairs, David asked Rachel not to do this and apologized for his behavior. The head woman put the phone away Her manipulation had worked perfectly. A few moments later, the hero turned to his friends gathered at the table and thanked them for their support. The guy then raised his glass of wine and spoke about the other students' dissatisfaction with the fact that he had not invited everyone. Afterwards, he swirled a glass of red wine and declared that he valued the quality of his friends, not their quantity. David smiled good-naturedly and said that the opinions of those sitting at this table were important to him. He offered them a drink, and the assembled people unanimously praised his toast and joyfully raised their glasses of wine. Rachel brought it to her lips and noticed a strange change in the student's character. Soon the protagonist stood up from his chair and suggested to the headman to put aside all differences. He touched her hand and suggested that they simply enjoy the delicious food. At first she was a little scared and looked at the student strangely. Suddenly she was distracted by a ringing phone. It must have been Nancy. Rachel answered the call immediately and brought the phone to her ear. At that very second, David grabbed the girl's wrist with his hand. The headmistress apologized for the accidental call. Nancy asked what she was doing now. She lied about reading books in the library. The next moment, she saw Ron right in front of her, carrying bags in his hands. The big guy stopped in front of her. The girl seemed not to notice him. The guy instantly froze in place, his face expressing a slight fear. Soon Nancy noticed him and, making a sarcastic face, asked where he was going. A few minutes later, Ron returned to the restaurant. The guest had just been served chicken soup, his face expressing concern. David happily greeted his returning comrade. The next second, he noticed something unusual, and his expression immediately changed. Nancy stood at the threshold of the room, glaring at the main character with satisfaction. Rachel almost jumped out of her chair when she saw her friend standing in front of her. The headman immediately smiled falsely and asked why she was here. Nancy immediately hinted at the girl's recent lie. She felt uneasy, lowered her eyes, and tried to find an explanation for her words. At that very second, Ron turned to the main character. He pointed to his chest and explained that he had accidentally bumped into the uninvited guest. The guy tried to tell in more detail what happened, but the hero remained languidly silent. The student put his hand on the big guy's shoulder and praised him for his fortitude, and he almost burst into tears. David then approached Nancy and invited her to join him for dinner. The guy sat her down on a chair right next to Rachel, and there was silence between them. After this, he raised his hand and suggested that they finally start eating. After some time, the hero began to sit down in his seat. Ron raised his hand and asked the waitress to bring 2 bottles of beer. The big guy also invited the main character to have a drink with them. He politely declined, arguing that he needed to meet with his coach. Nancy immediately jumped out of her chair and offered to go with him to have an important conversation. Rachel was surprised. The headman immediately felt awkward, and a feeling of jealousy awakened within her. Soon David and the unexpected guest went outside. Nancy asked the hero what he answered her father. He turned to her and proudly stated that he had only met Anthony a couple of times, so he couldn't talk about serious things. Then the guy waved it off and asked to be let go to the coach. Suddenly, Nancy grabbed his hand and asked him to stop. She guessed that her father did not understand her relationship with Rachel and demanded an explanation from the guy. David began to deny all her guesses, which were in fact true. Nancy became dissatisfied with the evasion of the answer. She pointed out her father's strange behavior when they first met in a restaurant. A drop of sweat rolled down the student's cheek, and he tried in vain to convince his friend otherwise. Soon he could not bear it any longer, and, jabbing his hand into his chest, called himself the scapegoat in this story. After this, Nancy turned her extraordinarily beautiful eyes straight at him. She then confessed to a morning conversation with her mother, which shed light on what was happening. The girl told the guy about the money that Anthony had given him, but he didn't see anything suspicious about it. The main character got nervous and decided to try not to let his friend take the initiative. Suddenly, Nancy broke into a satisfied grin and called the boy her obedient little dog. Jelly's face instantly changed, and he didn't understand what the girl was trying to achieve. She smiled and asked what the hero would do if she dispelled all her father's suspicions right now. David sighed and, raising his hand to his forehead, promised to return the money given to her by her father. After that, he began to glare at his girlfriend with displeasure, mentally demanding that she finally leave him alone. Nancy grinned slyly again and narrowed her eyes at the young man. She asked if the guy really didn't want to take the chance Anthony gave him to get closer to her. Her face became unpleasantly pleased. Her vanity aroused mistrust. David felt uneasy with her tone. She continued to press him. Then he took a small round candy out of his pocket and began to unwrap it. The student immediately threw it in his mouth and asked what the girl wanted from him. She looked at him with displeasure and thought about this important question herself. Nancy approached the hero and demanded immediate execution of all her orders. Her eyes were filled with a thirst for power. Otherwise, she would have to ruin David's image. Then she began to threaten the guy with her father's wrath, and he felt uneasy. After this, the vile ruler thanked the hero for the opportunity to solve all the problems at his expense. Nancy smiled venomously and offered to voluntarily agree to her terms. The main character's expression instantly changed. What had happened clearly caused him to misunderstand. The guy grabbed his head and began to think about the conditions he had heard. The girl then walked away, telling him before leaving that she wanted to start a relationship. If the hero behaves diligently, she may even give him a chance to become her boyfriend. He felt uneasy. Soon he laughed a little and joked about his girlfriend's goal of starting a relationship with him. The main character suggested that the girl find herself another boyfriend, because he had been in love with another for a long time. Then Nancy immediately thought of Rachel, Tina, and Brittany trying to show him attention. The girl then came closer to David. The mistress asked the student to stop pretending, because this deal would be beneficial for both of them. She looked at him with her beautiful eyes and told him about her pocket money, which had been lying around unused for a long time. She promised to transfer them to the guy's account if he would unquestioningly follow her orders. The main character really didn't like Nancy's character, and the fact that she took advantage of her financial situation. The student clutched his chest and pretended that such a proposal attracted him. Along the way, he asked why the girl treated him like her worst enemy. After this, the main character asked how much money Nancy could offer him. She immediately began bending her fingers and became immersed in calculations. The girl talked about her houses and cars, as well as the shares she owns. Nancy smiled sweetly and said that she could spend $3 million on David. The guy's eyes widened at the sight of such a huge sum. He scratched his head and agreed to the terms. The next moment, the student called Nancy his girlfriend, going against her wishes to control him. The young man folded his hands and recognized his girlfriend's rich family as an ideal opportunity to get rich himself. He smiled slyly, because he had never made serious plans for Nancy, and now she herself was asking him to become her boyfriend. The girl raised her index finger and promised to open a new account tomorrow and deposit $150,000 into it. Suddenly, she noticed the similarity between herself and David, who was ready to seize any opportunity to gain benefit. Unexpectedly, the main character just laughed, not wanting to become a girl's slave for such a tiny sum. Nancy became dissatisfied with the young man's reproaches. She said that her patience was about to run out, and the student came closer to her. Suddenly, the main character put his hand on his friend's shoulder and turned her towards him. Then he pressed himself against her and offered to please her a little. Nancy didn't even have time to respond before the guy pressed his lips to hers. All the people passing by looked at the couple kissing in the middle of the street with bewilderment. The girl's eyes widened in amazement. Afterwards, David asked his stunned girlfriend if she liked his kiss. Nancy took some time to recover from the unexpected kiss. After this, the young man jumped into an approaching taxi and, waving goodbye, called it a pledge for cooperation. Then he called the girl his assistant and grinned sarcastically. A few moments later, Nancy burst into real hysterics and began to insult the main character in every possible way. Her face turned very red with shame and embarrassment because he said that he would not be able to maintain a relationship with her. But despite this, she looked away and called her first kiss very pleasant. Her extraordinarily beautiful eyes seemed to sparkle, but she did not want to admit that she liked David. The thought of possible feelings for the guy took her breath away. Meanwhile, the hero, sitting in the taxi, was proud of his deed, because during the kiss, he managed to subjugate the girl to his will thanks to the magic chewing gum. He looked out the window with indifference, pondering Nancy's vile character. Then the student put his palm to his forehead and began to rejoice at his victory in this conversation. Despite this, he was overcome with sadness, because he was saving his first kiss for Rachel. At the same time, Nancy was very upset that she was unable to record any incriminating evidence against David on her dictaphone. A few minutes later, she entered the room where the protagonist's friends were sitting. The headman happily waved her hand and advised her to hurry, because the food was almost cold. Along the way, she asked if David had really left. Suddenly, her eyes widened and she noticed something suspicious. Rachel looked at Nancy's mouth and she was horrified. The angry headmistress asked her friend what happened to her lips. The girl was very scared, because she completely forgot to look in the mirror. She quickly covered her mouth with her hands, but Rachel had already told her about the rubbed-off lipstick. Nancy tried to lie about recently eating gum. The headwoman pointed out the price of the girl's cosmetics. It shouldn't wash off so easily. The girl felt very awkward when Rachel began to carefully examine her lips. Suddenly, the headwoman smiled and told her about her friend's chapped lips, and she was horrified. She immediately covered her lips with her hands, but the headman was already determined to find out the truth. Rachel gave her friend a displeased and rather angry look. She immediately recognized their kiss from Nancy's lost and frightened face. The headman's hand clenched into a tight fist out of jealousy. Suddenly, she stood up from her chair and put her hand to her friend's chin. Rachel moved closer to the girl's lips and kissed them forcefully. Soon, the head woman smelled cherry gum and thought about her friend's words. After that, she looked at Nancy with suspicion and decided that it was she who forcibly kissed the main character. Suddenly, Mike, who had remained silent for a long time, began to cough very loudly. Tina and Brittany looked at the headman with obvious bewilderment on their faces. A few moments later, Nancy jumped up from her seat and loudly announced her resignation. She immediately ran out of the room and began to reflect on the strange sensations that visited her after kissing David. She blushed and became very upset, assuming that she might be in love with the hero. Ron regretted that he didn't manage to take a photo of the two girls kissing. Rachel was furious at these words. A few minutes later, the students said goodbye to the guys and thanked them for calling a taxi. Mike and Ron waved back, looking forward to seeing them again. After that, they headed towards the dormitory, discussing the events that had happened on this unusually strange evening. Ron talked about the insane beauty that Rachel and Nancy possess. Mike, however, expressed the assumption that the head girl was really in love with her friend. They walked and discussed for a long time and heatedly the kiss between two students. Their conversation was accidentally overheard by Ethan, who was passing by. He took his phone out of his pocket and decided to immediately report what had happened to the girl's father. Meanwhile, the main character was in the gym and received a message on his phone. In it, Judy congratulated the guy on the fact that he managed to bring 3 girls to dinner at once. David immediately realized that she found out about it through Mike and his sister. Judy laughed out loud when she heard about this event. She thanked Catherine for having such a good brother and called him really reliable, and she laughed a little. The guy explained to his girlfriend that this dinner was just a small snack before strength training. Catherine was attracted by the hero's passion for sports. David tried to become stronger so that he could protect Judy from John if he came after her again, which shocked her. Soon the student shared a photo with her from the gym. The changes in his body were already very noticeable. Catherine leaned on her arm and wondered if her friend really had feelings for the young man. She decided that she wouldn't be able to resist him either if she were in her place. Soon Judy told her friend about the young man's desire to invite them for a walk on the weekend, and she advised her to go together. The girl agreed with Catherine's opinion and decided to write to the main character. Instead, she noticed her friend's sad face. The next moment, it seemed like an epiphany had struck the girl. Judy noticed that Catherine almost always blushes when talking about David. Perhaps she also has feelings for him. The girl wrote to the guy and suggested discussing the details of the meeting a little later. The young man was a little upset and decided that she was too busy right now. Suddenly, Tina wrote to him, telling him about an unusual incident in the restaurant. She walked behind the head girl and Brittany, who was holding her hand. The red-haired student decided that what happened would scare the hero away from Rachel and Nancy. Tina told David about their kiss, which happened right in the restaurant. The main character, who was thrown to the ground by the coach, was shocked by this news. He reread his friend's message several times, but still did not believe in such a development of events. Then he asked the coach to take a short break. The man asked him to bring his beloved here in the future so that they could meet. After this, the hero contacted the headman under the guise of Ham. Most likely, the effect of the gum was passed on to her. Until the very end, David did not believe that Rachel could kiss a girl in order to spite him. He hit himself on the forehead with his palm and blamed himself for his girlfriend's corruption. He felt uneasy just thinking about it. The young man immediately remembered the ill-fated parcel that had set off the chain of these unpleasant events. Nancy's deliberate provocations came before his eyes. He also remembered the girl's parents, who made Rachel think that he was in love with their daughter. He headed towards the exit of the gym, thinking about his rebirth, which forced events to take a completely different path. The student pointed out to the girl that she was being too active and that she was acting too forcefully. Rachel thought about his words and tried to understand what they meant. The main character called her character too strong, which makes her irritable and paranoid. The headman's eyes widened in surprise, because his assumption turned out to be the pure truth. David advised her to spend more time with the guy of her dreams. Brittany was puzzled by her friend's behavior. Rachel began to suspect something was wrong, because it was the hero who caused her unusual behavior. After this, Ham wrote her a wise quotation, and she, looking at the sky, found his advice very useful. Suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, an unpleasant thought came to her. She immediately rushed away, explaining to her friends that she had forgotten something very important. Tina and Brittany found their friend's behavior very strange and suspicious. Soon the headman reached a small cafe and asked the guy if he was free. He joked about another night at the hotel. The girl didn't particularly like his behavior because she wanted to simply talk to him. The student then offered to book the room at his expense, but Rachel refused. After that, he said that he would call another girlfriend, in his opinion. This bluff should work perfectly. The slightly angry headmistress assumed that he was going to call Tina. She put the phone on the table and decided that her friend would immediately agree to such a proposal. Suddenly, she noticed Nancy, who was clearly in a hurry on the street. These circumstances made the girl nervous and decided that the guy had invited her specifically. She then immediately called David and asked where he was right now. Then the girl asked if he had invited Nancy to his place. The guy in the toilet couldn't believe his ears. This question seemed to come out of nowhere. He immediately assumed that the headman had seen the girl, so he asked her why she thought so. The next moment, Rachel hung up, and the student looked at the phone in bewilderment. Meanwhile, the headman caught up with Nancy and stopped her, frightening her greatly. She said it was already quite late for solitary walks. Nancy asked her friend why she wasn't in the dorm yet, and she replied that she had decided to take a little walk. The headman again asked where the girl was heading. She explained that her mother had become unwell and that she needed to check her immediately. Rachel, suspecting the lie in her words, offered to visit her together. The girl politely dissuaded her from this idea. The headman called solitary walks at such a late hour very dangerous. She grabbed Nancy's hand and suggested that they go back to the dorm together after visiting Vanessa. She really didn't like the rapidly developing relationship between her and the main character. In the end, Nancy agreed to take Rachel with her, which Rachel was incredibly happy about. A couple of minutes later, they actually arrived at her parents' mansion. The puzzled headman could not believe that the girl was telling the truth. Soon Vanessa came out to the students, not looking her best. Suddenly, Rachel bowed to her and said that she had come with Nancy to support her and help her get well. The woman leaned on the railing with her right hand and thanked her for her concern. In fact, she was going to discuss the recent kiss with her daughter, but now the situation was complicated by the arrival of the headman, which made her feel a little worse. Vanessa clutched her head and chest, and her worried daughter reached out her hand to her. She reassured Nancy and went into the room to lie down and rest a little. The girl silently watched her mother go. Then she glared at Rachel and declared that it was all her fault. After this, Nancy sat down on the sofa and asked imperiously why the headmistress had followed her. She looked away and joked about her friend's wealth, which could make anyone fall in love with her. The girl did not appreciate such humor and demanded to watch what Rachel said. Nancy then gave her a displeased look and promised to take revenge for today's incident.